The bitter, grassy smell stung his nose so badly that he felt like sneezing. Then came the heaviness. The blanket pressed down on his chest like a sack of sand. His lungs wheezed with every breath. His fingers were thin and white, like a corpse's. He tried to clench his fist. He managed it. Weakly, but he managed it. So he could work. Behind the screen in the corner of the room, a woman was speaking. Her voice was tired and angry. She was telling someone that he'd taken to his bed again, and that his brothers would be coming tomorrow to pick up the shipment on Kozhevanaya Street. Daniel Crow didn't know what Kozhevanaya Street was. He didn't know who this woman was. He didn't know why his body felt as heavy as an empty sack, or why someone else's memories were swarming in his head. 30 seconds ago, he had been falling from a bridge into an icy river in Montana, and now he was lying in a stranger's bed, listening to a stranger's wife. The room had a merchant's air about it. Sturdy furniture, thick walls, dust on the curtain rods. The lady of the house was either in mourning or in a panic, most likely both. Someone else's memories churned in his head like murky water. Images surfaced in fragments. A boy of about 10 hiding behind a closet. A teenager apologizing to someone without looking up. A young man stands at his own wedding, afraid to look at his bride. Daniel Ashton, 26 years old, husband of the merchant's wife, Meriwether Ashton. Frail, weak, timid. All his life, he had been afraid of everything under the sun. And now his body belonged to a man who had spent 10 years driving wagon trains across snowy mountain passes and managing a warehouse network spanning 20,000 cubic meters. Daniel cleared his throat. A wheeze echoed from his chest. He propped himself up on his elbow. The room swayed but remained steady. He turned his head toward the Cath and spoke. The voice was unfamiliar, quiet, hoarse. But the words were his. He asked Mary to bring the ledgers, all of them, and a map of the city. He said he wanted to see what they had. It grew quiet behind the screen, as quiet as it gets when a person has long since stopped expecting good news and suddenly hears something strange. A minute later, a woman emerged from behind the screen. She was about 30. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun. Her face was beautiful but haggard. Dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were dry from constant work. She looked at him the way one looks at a patient who suddenly spoke after a month of silence, with hope and suspicion at the same time. Meriwether asked why he wanted the ledgers. He replied that he wanted to understand how much they owed and how much was owed to them. She continued to stand there. Then she said that he hadn't opened the ledgers even once in the 4 years of their marriage. Daniel looked her in the eyes. The Daniel of the past wouldn't have done that. The Daniel of the past would have looked at the floor. He said he would open them now. Mary left the room. Daniel leaned back against the pillow and closed his eyes. He had to think fast. His brothers were coming tomorrow, behind the warehouse. That meant someone in the family considered Meriwether the weak link. His husband was on his deathbed. Business was going badly. It was the perfect time to seize the property. He didn't yet know the city, the laws, or the balance of power. But he knew one thing. Any redistribution of property begins with pressure. And pressure only works as long as the victim is afraid. Mary returned 20 minutes later. She brought 4 thick, leather-bound books and a sheet of paper rolled into a tube. A map of the city. Daniel sat up in bed. His head was spinning, but his hands obeyed him. He unrolled the map. The city was called Remhold, the capital of the Kingdom of Valomark. A river port. Shopping arcades along the main street. The Tanner's Quarter to the west. The meat market next to the lower market. He found Tanner's Street. Next to it was a warehouse sign marked Ashton. He opened the first book. The handwriting was small and scrawled. Not Mary's. Someone else had kept the records. A clerk. Daniel began to read. An hour later, he knew the essentials. The Ashton family owned 3 shops and 1 warehouse. 2 shops sold meat and hides at the lower market. The 3rd shop sold finished leather in the craftsman's quarter. The warehouse on Leather Street was key. All the goods passed through it. Profits had been falling for the 3rd year in a row. Debts were mounting. Suppliers were jacking up prices. Half the goods were spoiling in transit. A manager named Hawthorne kept the books sloppily. Entire pages were filled with a single line, with no details. Daniel knew what that meant. Either laziness, or theft, or both. He closed the book and looked at Mary. She was sitting by the window looking at him, waiting. He asked who Hawthorne was. Mary replied that he was an old steward. He'd served her father as well, 30 years with the family. Daniel asked if she trusted him. Mary paused. Then she said that Hawthorne had always been loyal to her father. Daniel noted that she hadn't answered his question. He asked about her brothers. Mary replied that there were two of them, the older one, Aldrich, and the younger one, Hart. Aldrich is married to the town judge's daughter. Hart runs a slaughterhouse on the southern outskirts. Both believe that Mary is not handling her husband's affairs properly. Both want the warehouse on Leather Street. Daniel asked on what grounds. Mary explained that under the Valimark law, a wife's property is managed by her husband. If the husband is incapacitated, the wife's relatives can demand that control be transferred to them. Daniel understood. While Daniel Ashton was on his deathbed, the brothers had the right to pressure him. But if the husband got back on his feet and proved he was capable of running the business, those grounds would disappear. He didn't just need to get back on his feet. He needed to show results. Overnight. He asked Mary what people usually did with werewolf hind legs. Mary was surprised. She said they threw them away. The meat is tough and smells like a dog. Nobody buys it. Daniel asked if he could buy such a leg at the market. Mary said the butchers would give it to him for free. They'd be happy to get rid of it. Daniel asked her to send a boy to the market in the morning to bring back a werewolf's hind leg. And also, vinegar, salt, juniper berries, hot water. Mary asked why. Daniel replied that he was going to cook dinner for her brothers. Mary looked at him for a long time. Then she said he'd never cooked in his life. Daniel replied that he would now. He spent the night poring over his books. His body ached. His eyes watered in the dim candlelight. But his mind was working. He wrote down all the income and expenses for the past year on a separate sheet of paper. The picture was clear. The Ashtons bought meat and hides from middlemen at the lower market. There were at least 4 middlemen between the hunter in the forest and the Ashtons' counter. Each took their cut. The meat arrived half-rotten. The hides arrived poorly tanned. Valuable parts of the carcasses were thrown away out of ignorance. Hunters in the east were paid a pittance. The middlemen were getting rich. And the Ashtons, at the end of the chain, received scraps at an inflated price and tried to sell them at a markup that didn't even cover their shop rent. Daniel had seen this scheme hundreds of times. In another world. In another life. The supply chain was too long. There were no direct contracts with the producer. No incoming quality control. No standardization. No cold chain logistics. Any COO could fix this in 6 months. The question was whether he'd have 6 months. He got up in the morning. His legs were shaking. He held onto the wall as he walked down the hallway. A young woman was sitting in the kitchen. She was thin. Sharp cheekbones. Dark, alert eyes. She was reading a book and drinking tea. When she saw him, she flinched and set down her cup. A distant memory prompted the name. Hannah Claiborne. Mary's cousin. She lived in the house as a poor relative. Hannah said she hadn't expected to see him on his feet. There was a hint of venom in her voice, the usual kind. She was clearly used to treating him with polite contempt. Daniel nodded and asked for tea. Hannah raised an eyebrow. The old Daniel never asked for anything. The old Daniel apologized for his very existence. She poured him some tea. Daniel sat down at the table and asked if she knew how to count. Hannah replied that she did. Daniel asked if she was good at it. Hannah said that she was better than any steward in this house. There was no boastfulness in her voice. There was anger. The anger of someone who had never been taken seriously. Daniel pulled a sheet of calculations from his breast pocket and placed it in front of her. He asked her to check the numbers. Hannah looked at the sheet, then at him, then back at the sheet. She picked up a quill and began checking. 10 minutes later, she looked up and said that 3 entries in Hawthorne's records didn't add up. The transportation costs were inflated. The write-off for spoilage wasn't substantiated. And 1 large purchase of salt and hides wasn't recorded in the goods received at all. Daniel nodded. He'd already noticed this. But he needed someone else to see it too, someone from the family. He told Hannah that he would need her help, not just once, but on an ongoing basis. Hannah looked at him skeptically and asked what exactly she would be helping with. Daniel replied that he needed someone to keep the books. Real bookkeeping, not what Hawthorne does. Hannah was silent for about 5 seconds. Then she asked why he thought she'd agree. Daniel answered simply, because she's the only person in this house who could spot a mistake in the books in 10 minutes. And because she finds it interesting. Hannah didn't reply, but she didn't refuse either. Around noon, a boy came running back from the market. He dragged in a werewolf's hind leg wrapped in a rag. The meat was dark, almost black. It had a pungent smell. Any local butcher would have thrown it away without a second thought. Daniel asked for a large basin to be brought. Hot water, vinegar, salt, juniper berries, a knife. Mary stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Hannah stood behind her. Both were silent. Daniel placed the meat on the table and began to work. His hands remembered. Not the hands of Daniel Ashton, the hands of Daniel Crow. 10 years of butchering carcasses in Montana's national parks. He knew that the hind leg of any large predator is tough because of the tendons that work when running. But if you butcher it correctly, separating the membranes and tendons from the muscle tissue, cutting thinly across the grain, and soaking it in an acidic solution, the meat will become tender. The doggy smell comes from the fat under the skin. You have to trim off all the fat, then soak the meat in water with vinegar for 2 hours, then pat it dry. Rub it with salt and juniper berries, and sear it quickly over high heat while the center is still pink. He worked in silence. His hands moved precisely and efficiently. Mary watched intently. She had lived with this man for 4 years and had never once seen him hold a knife. After 2 hours, the meat was soaked. Daniel patted it dry with a clean cloth. He sliced it into thin strips. He rubbed it with salt and crushed berries. A skillet was sizzling on the stove. He couldn't find any oil, but he did find rendered fat. That would do. The meat sizzled as it hit the hot metal. The smell changed instantly. Instead of the stench of a dog, a rich, meaty aroma filled the air, with a smoky note and the piney bitterness of juniper. Hannah swallowed hard behind him. Mary stepped closer. Daniel flipped the slices after a minute and a half. A golden crust with dark spots had formed. He took the meat off the fire and arranged it on a clay platter. He tasted it himself. Slightly sweet, smoky. A bit tougher than beef, but the texture is pleasant. The fibers separate on the tongue. If served warm with bread and herbs, this isn't just a meal. It's a dish that could be served in expensive taverns. He held out a slice to Mary. She took it carefully. She took a bite. She chewed slowly. Something was changing on her face. She took another bite. Then she looked at him and asked quietly how he knew that. Daniel replied that he'd read about it. Mary didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes, but she didn't argue. The brothers arrived after lunch. Aldrich was a large, broad-shouldered man with a strong jaw and a way of speaking as if everything had already been decided. Hart was slimmer and quieter, but his eyes darted about. He was calculating, weighing things up. They entered the house like they owned the place. Aldrich nodded to Mary and didn't even look at Daniel. He sat down at the table and said they'd come to discuss business. The warehouse on Kojavanaya Street was sitting idle. The goods were spoiling. Mary couldn't handle it alone. It would be better if management were handed over to those who understood trade. He said this in an even tone. He wasn't threatening. He was simply stating a fact. Fact. Decision. Signature. Mary stood there, pale. Daniel saw her clench her hands behind her back. She had been preparing for this conversation, preparing to lose. Daniel asked to wait half an hour. Aldrich looked at him for the first time, with surprise. His sister's husband stood before him on his own 2 feet, thin, pale, but standing, and looking him in the eye. Aldrich shrugged and said he'd wait. Half an hour later, Daniel returned to the room with a clay platter. On the platter lay thin slices of seared meat. He set the platter on the table in front of the brothers and said it was a werewolf's hind leg. Aldrich snorted. He said it was trash. Daniel replied that it was 4 silver coins a pound. Aldrich fell silent. 4 silver coins a pound was the price of good venison, for meat that everyone throws away. Daniel suggested he try some. Aldrich took a piece. He chewed, frowning. 3 days until the trial shipment arrives. 10 pounds of werewolf meat. Daniel started by taking inventory. The boy from the market had brought back 1 hind leg yesterday. It yielded about 4 pounds of usable meat after trimming the fat and tendons. That meant he needed at least 3 legs. Better yet 4, with a few extra in case of waste. He sent the boy back to the market with instructions to go around to all butchers in the lower row and collect werewolf hind legs, as many as he could find. No need to pay. They give them away for free, for now at least. The boy returned around lunchtime with 2 legs and some news. One of the butchers had asked why anyone would want so much scrap. Daniel nodded. The questions had already begun. A free resource remains free exactly until the moment no one understands its value. He had maybe 2 weeks before the market caught on. He worked all day, butchering, trimming, soaking. Daniel Ashton's hands were weak and tired quickly. After an hour of working with the knife, his fingers went numb. He had to stop, stretch his hands, wait, continue. Mary peeked into the kitchen twice. The first time she said nothing. The second time, she brought tea and set it down nearby. She didn't say a word. She left. Daniel thought that gesture was worth more than any words. That evening he called for Hannah. She came in with a pen and a blank notebook. Daniel dictated a list to her. How many pounds of raw meat? How many pounds after trimming? How much vinegar was used? How much salt? How many berries? Soaking time, cooking time, yield of the finished product. Hannah wrote it down quickly and accurately. When he finished, she looked up and said that they were getting about 40% of the original weight. Daniel nodded. 40% is a good yield for wild game. Hannah asked why he was calculating all of this. He replied that without numbers, there's no business, just a lot of fuss. Hannah was silent for a moment. Then she said that in 30 years, Hawthorne had never once calculated the yield. Daniel replied that that was exactly why things were the way they were. On the second day, Daniel got up before dawn. His body protested. His knees ached. His chest wheezed. He drank some hot water and sat down with a map. He needed to think ahead. The test shipment for the brothers was a tactic, a small move to buy a week's time. The real challenge lay elsewhere. He needed a stable supply chain. Hunters kill beasts in the east. The meat and hides pass through 4 middlemen and arrive in the capital half-rotten. Daniel wanted to cut out all the middlemen and establish a direct line. Hunter, transshipment point, capital. 3 links, not 8. To do this, he needed a village on the eastern road that would agree to work directly with him. Wolf Ford. A 2-day journey. But he couldn't go there himself. His body wouldn't hold up on the trip. So he needed an envoy, someone he could trust. He weighed his options. Hawthorne was out of the question. Daniel didn't trust him one bit. The messenger boy was too young. Mary couldn't leave the shop. Hannah. He thought of her. Smart, quick-witted, but she'd never left town. She didn't know how to talk to the village hunters, so it was too soon. That meant the first contact would have to be made through a letter. He asked Hannah to find out if anyone was traveling east with a wagon train in the coming days. Hannah returned an hour later. She said that Merchant Fenwick's caravan was leaving the day after tomorrow and would pass through Wolf Ford. He could have the letter delivered by one of the drivers. Daniel sat down to write. The letter was addressed to the headman of Wolf Ford, short and to the point. He introduced himself as a merchant from Remhold. He wrote that he was ready to buy the hunters directly from the hunters, without middlemen. He offered prices 3 times higher than what the middlemen paid. In return, he asked for one thing: the complete butchering of the carcass. Not just the meat and hide, but also the liver, tendons, glands, hooves, and blood. Everything, according to the list he attached to the letter. He'd compiled this list overnight. 17 items. 17 items from a single werewolf carcass. The locals took 3. He knew what to do with the remaining 14. The liver for alchemists, the tendons for bowmakers, the glands for apothecaries, the hooves for glue, the blood dried into powder for sausages, the gallbladders for tanning hides, the bones for handles and reagents. Even the fur from the withers, if combed out properly, could be made into felt. He attached a butchering diagram to the letter. Simple, clear, with notes on where to cut and what to keep. He'd drawn it himself. His hands were shaking, but the lines were crisp. Daniel Crow's memory knew the anatomy of any large predator. A werewolf was no more complicated than a moose if you understood the basic principles. Hannah looked at the diagram and asked how he knew the anatomy of a werewolf. Daniel replied that he'd read a lot. Hannah raised an eyebrow. She said there wasn't a single book on butchering in the Ashton Library. Daniel replied that he'd read them before the wedding. Hannah didn't believe him. She could tell by the look on his face, but she said nothing. She handed the letter to Fenwick, the wagon driver, and got him to promise to deliver it. On the third day, Daniel finished processing the last legs. 10 pounds of prepared meat lay on a platter, soaked, rubbed with salt and juniper, and ready for roasting. Aldrich arrived alone, without Hart. Was that a bad sign or a good one? Daniel couldn't tell just yet. Aldrich sat down at the table and looked at the platter. Daniel seared the meat in front of him. Aldrich tasted every piece. Silently. Thoroughly. Then he pulled a piece of paper from his breast pocket. It was a deed, confirming that the warehouse on Leather Street remained under the management of Meriwether Ashton. Aldrich's signature and seal. Aldrich placed the paper on the table and said he wanted a contract. 20 pounds a week. 4 silver coins per pound. Daniel nodded. 20 pounds a week. That's 5 hind legs. It's doable for now. Aldrich added that he had one more condition. He wanted to know where Daniel got his meat and how he prepared it. Daniel replied that he bought the meat at the market and was willing to sell the recipe for a separate fee. Aldrich narrowed his eyes. Then he smiled. He said that Daniel had become a different person after his illness. Daniel replied that illness changes people. Aldrich left with 10 pounds of meat and the signed contract. Mary held the contract with both hands and read it 3 times. Then she placed it on the table and smoothed it out with her palm. Daniel could see she wanted to cry. But she didn't cry. She just said quietly that her father would be pleased. That evening, Daniel asked Hannah to sit down with him. He explained his plan to her. Not the whole plan, just the first stage. They needed to deal directly with the hunters, cut the middlemen out of the chain, organize the complete butchering of the carcasses, 17 steps instead of 3, and set up proper storage. The meat spoils because it isn't refrigerated. He knows how to fix that. Ice pits. Pits on the northern slope of the hill filled with river ice from the winter. Line them with straw. The meat will stay fresh for weeks. Hannah listened in silence. Then she asked how much it would cost. Daniel replied that the first ice pit would cost 20 silver pieces, the equivalent of 3 days' worth of trade. Hannah said that Hawthorne would call it madness. Daniel replied that Hawthorne wouldn't know. Hannah looked at him intently. She asked if he was planning to get rid of Hawthorne. Daniel replied that no, not yet. Hawthorne is useful. He knows every merchant in town, every middleman, every cart driver. His connections are more valuable than his honesty. But Hannah is keeping the books now. Hannah asked why he trusted her. They'd known each other for 3 days. Daniel replied that she'd found 3 errors in the books in 10 minutes. Anyone capable of that deserves trust. Hannah smiled. For the first time in 3 days. She said it was the strangest compliment she'd ever heard. That night, Daniel lay awake, thinking. His body ached. Every joint throbbed, his lungs wheezed. But his mind was clear. He thought about how the former Daniel Ashton had been sick for a long time. A very long time. Someone else's memory reminded him. The cough had started 2 years ago. Then came the weakness. Then the fainting spells. The doctor said it was consumption. But Daniel was lying in this body now and could feel that his lungs were weak but not destroyed. Not consumption. Something else. And another thing. Every morning, a maid named Gladys brought him a herbal decoction. Bitter. With that very same smell he'd noticed upon waking. Mary said the doctor had prescribed the decoction, to be drunk every morning on an empty stomach. Daniel had been drinking it for 2 years. 2 years of illness. 2 years of the decoction. Daniel didn't drink it the first morning because the smell was unbearable. He didn't drink it the second morning because he'd forgotten. He didn't drink it on the third morning because he started thinking. 3 days without the decoction, and he was already back on his feet. A coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. He decided to keep quiet about it, for now, to observe. Who brings the decoction? Who prepares it? Who orders the herbs? And to keep not drinking it. On the morning of the 4th day, Hawthorne arrived. Daniel saw him for the first time. The steward was an old man, withered, veiny hands, eyes sharp and quick. He entered the room and stopped when he saw Daniel at the table poring over books. Hawthorne bowed and said he was glad to see the master back on his feet. His voice was even. Too even. Daniel thanked him and said he wanted to discuss business. Hawthorne sat down. Daniel asked questions. How much inventory was in the warehouse? Which suppliers were currently working with them? What were the outstanding debts? Which contracts were in effect? Hawthorne answered in detail and with confidence. 30 years of experience. He knew every little detail. But Daniel noticed the pauses. Small ones. Almost imperceptible. Before certain questions, Hawthorne would pause for a split second, choosing his words. This concerned transportation costs and write-offs for spoilage, the very items Hannah had flagged as suspicious. Daniel didn't press the issue. Instead, he gave Hawthorne a new assignment, to compile a list of all the butchers in the lower market with prices, volumes, and terms. Hawthorne nodded and left. Daniel watched him go. This man was either stealing little by little or working for someone else, or both. But he can't be taken out right now. His connections are needed, his knowledge is needed. And as long as he thinks his boss is weak and clueless, he'll stay calm. And a calm thief is predictable. A week later, the cart driver returned from Fenwick's convoy. The village headman's house was warm and dark. The log walls were blackened by smoke. On the table stood a jug of something murky and 3 clay mugs. The village head introduced himself as Bran. He sat down across from Daniel and rested his hands on the table, large, heavy hands covered in scars. He looked at Daniel and waited. Daniel started with the numbers. He asked how much the middlemen paid for a werewolf pelt. Bran answered, half a silver coin. Daniel asked how much for the meat. Bran said they paid for the meat by weight, a quarter of a silver coin for 10 pounds. Daniel asked what they did with the rest. The liver, the tendons, the glands, the hooves. Bran shrugged. They throw it away. They feed it to the dogs. Nobody wants it. Daniel placed a price list on the table. He'd put it together in the wagon on the way here. Werewolf pelt, 4 silver coins. Meat, 2 silver coins per 10 pounds. Liver, 1 silver coin each. Tendons, half a silver coin per bundle. Glands, 2 silver coins per pair. Hooves, a quarter of a silver coin per set. Dried blood, 1 silver coin per pound of powder, and so on. 17 items. Bran read the list for a long time. He moved his lips. Then he looked up and said it was a joke. Daniel replied that he wasn't joking. Bran said that at those prices, 1 werewolf would cost nearly 15 silver coins. Dealers pay less silver. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Bran leaned back on the bench and looked at him the way people look at a madman or a con artist. He asked what the catch was. Daniel explained. The catch is that all these parts need to be cut up properly, not the way they're done now. He pulled out the diagram, the very one he'd drawn with trembling hands by candlelight, and spread it out on the table. He showed where to cut, what to keep, how to skin the animal without damaging the pelt, and how to remove the glands intact. How to drain the blood into a separate container before it clotted. Bran listened. He'd been a hunter for 40 years. He knew the beasts better than anyone in that room. But he had never seen anyone treat a werewolf carcass as a treasure trove from which 17 different items could be extracted. He called for his daughter. A minute later, a young woman entered the room. She was short and stocky, wearing leather pants. A butcher's knife tucked into her belt. Her hair was pulled back into a short ponytail. Her eyes were gray and direct. She looked at Daniel without a greeting, without a bow, without interest. She looked at him the way people look at a town merchant who's come to pull their leg. Bran said this was his daughter Abby, the village's best marksman. Daniel nodded. Bran handed her the butchering diagram. Abby looked at it. Then she raised her head and said that the glands couldn't be removed without damaging them if she cut along that line. In a werewolf, they sit deeper than shown, under the 3rd rib, not the 2nd. Daniel looked at her. Then he said she was right. He'd drawn it based on a large predator he'd known before. If the glands in a werewolf are located deeper, the cutting line needs to be adjusted. He asked Abby to show him exactly where. Abby took a quill and corrected the diagram, quickly and confidently. Daniel looked at the corrected drawing and said it was right now. Abby lifted her head and, for the first time, looked at him with something other than indifference, with surprise. A city merchant who admitted his mistake and asked a country girl to correct it. She'd never seen anything like it. Bran watched silently. Then he asked the crucial question. Why should he trust a merchant from the capital? Middlemen had made promises too. Then they'd cheated, paid less, delayed payment, sent scales with tampered weights. Daniel replied. He wasn't asking him to take his word for it. He was offering a trial month. 1 guild, 1 batch of game, divided according to his plan. Payment upon delivery, in cash, no delays. If the prices turned out to be even a kopeck lower than promised, Bran could spread the word to every village from Wolf's Ford to Burnt Ridge, and not a single hunter would ever do business with the Ashtons again. Bran was silent. He was thinking. Then he said there was one more problem: equipment. The crossbows were worn out. The traps were rusty. Half the team's boots were full of holes. A hunter without equipment isn't a hunter, he's a dead man. And the gear costs so much that the entire season's haul goes toward paying for it. Daniel had been expecting this question. He proposed a model that in his world was called a trade credit. He provides the hunters with gear, crossbows, boots, and traps. Not on credit with money, against future game, at a fixed price. A hunter takes a crossbow worth 10 silver pieces and delivers game worth that amount at the prices listed in the price list. No interest, no pressure. If a hunter dies, the debt is written off. Bran listened without moving. Abby stood by the wall and listened too. Daniel saw her expression change. First, disbelief, then calculation, then something resembling hope, quickly suppressed. She was used to not hoping. Bran asked where Daniel would get that many crossbows and boots. Daniel replied that it was his concern. Bran asked when they could start. Daniel replied in 2 weeks. He needed to return to the city to buy equipment and set up a receiving station. Bran stood up. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. Bran's hand was like a pair of pliers. Daniel's hand was like a twig. But the handshake took place. That evening, Bran invited them to dinner. Half the village was seated at the table. Hunters with weather-beaten faces, their wives, children. Daniel ate what was served: tough meat, black bread, and sour beer. He sat next to Mary and listened. The hunters talked about how there were more creatures now. Werewolves were coming closer. Bone breakers had been spotted by the river last week. The moon deer had moved farther east, which meant something was driving them. Something big. An old hunter named Hank said this had happened before, 20 years ago, before the Great Migration, when the beasts poured out of the wildlands in a wave and 3 villages burned down in a single night. Back then, the crown sent soldiers, but by the time the soldiers arrived, it was already too late. Daniel remembered everything. Every name, every fact, every detail. Hank knows the wolf trail. It's an alternate route through the forest. It's a day and a half shorter than the main road, but more dangerous. This is information. Valuable. For the future. Mary sat quietly beside him. She was watching. Daniel could feel her gaze. She watched as he talked to the hunters, as he listened, as he memorized. The old Daniel would have sat hunched over at a table like this and said nothing. This Daniel asked questions, and people answered him. Because he asked the right way, not condescendingly, not like a city dandy, but like someone who truly cared. After dinner, they stayed the night at Bran's house. Mary lay down on a bench against the wall. Daniel lay on the floor on a straw mattress. He stared at the ceiling and thought. The agreement with Wolf Ford is the first step. 1 village, 1 cooperative. But if it works, it will become a model. He'll be able to replicate it in every village along the Eastern Road. 15 villages, 20 cooperatives, direct deliveries, complete butchering. 17 products from each carcass instead of 3. Cold storage at intermediate points. Standard prices. A seal of quality. This isn't a shop, it's a chain. In the darkness, Mary asked quietly. She asked why he was doing this. Daniel remained silent. She pressed him. A year ago, he couldn't get out of bed. 3 days ago, he opened his ledgers for the first time. And now he was lying on the floor of a village house 2 days' journey from the capital, negotiating with hunters. What had happened? Daniel replied that he'd realized one thing. If he didn't do this, no one else would. And then Mary would live in fear of every tomorrow for the rest of her life. Mary was silent for a long time. Then she said that this was the first time he'd told her something about her and not about himself. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Because he was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. He wasn't doing it just for Mary's sake. He was doing it because he knew how. Because for the first time in 3 days in this world, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling that he was standing for the right cause. That his hands, though weak, were doing the work that needed to be done. That tomorrow would be better than today. In the morning, he woke up with a pain in his back. Daniel Ashton's body was taking its toll from the trip. But he got up. Before leaving, he asked Abby for one thing. If, in 2 weeks, he sent a man with the first shipment of equipment, Abby would meet him and oversee the first cut according to the new plan. In person. Every cut. Every gland. Every bone. Abby nodded. Then she asked why a city merchant would need a country girl for this. Daniel replied that he didn't need just anyone. He needed someone who knew the animals better than he did, and who wouldn't be afraid to tell him to his face that he was wrong. Like yesterday with the diagram, Abby blinked. That morning, Daniel didn't drink his herbal tea. Gladys, the maid, brought it as usual. She set it on the bedside table and left. Daniel waited until the door closed. He picked up the cup. He sniffed it. Bitter. Herbal. Heavy. He poured the tea into the pot with the flower on the windowsill. My 8th day without the decoction. His body had grown noticeably stronger. His lungs were still wheezing, but they no longer whistled. His hands held the pen without trembling. He could walk from his house to the lower market without stopping. 2 weeks ago, he couldn't even make it to the kitchen. Either he was recovering from his illness, or he had stopped receiving the poison. He couldn't prove the latter yet. But the facts were adding up in an inconvenient way. Daniel went out into the city. Remhold was bustling with trade that morning. Carts creaked along the cobblestones. Butchers were laying out their wares on the counters. Leather workers were hauling bundles of hides toward the tanning pits. The smell of a big city. Manure, smoke, raw leather, fresh bread. He walked through the lower market, taking it all in. Stalls, counters, signs. He was looking for 2 things, salt and alchemy. He found the salt quickly. At the southern end of the market stood a stall with a sign in 2 languages, Valamark runes, and some other symbols he didn't recognize. A young woman sat behind the counter. Her black hair was braided into a plait. A narrow face. Dark eyes. In front of her lay bags of different kinds of salt. Coarse white salt, fine gray salt, pink rock salt, and one more kind, yellowish, with the scent of the sea. Daniel stopped. He asked what the yellow salt was. The woman looked up. She eyed him appraisingly. She replied that it was sea salt from the southern islands, the best for salting fish and meat. The crystals were large. It retains moisture. It doesn't turn bitter at high temperatures. Daniel asked the price. The woman quoted it, 2 silver coins per sack. That's expensive. Daniel asked how much she had. The woman replied that she had 20 sacks in stock, and she could bring more if there was demand. He asked her name, Yujin So, the daughter of a spice merchant from the southern coast. Daniel asked if she traded under her own name. Yujin paused for a second. Then she replied curtly, No, under my father's name. Daniel asked why. Yujin said it was none of his business. Daniel nodded. He apologized for asking and got down to business. He explained that he needed salt. A lot. On a regular basis. To preserve the meat of wild animals at transit points along the eastern road. Sea salt works best because of its large crystals and stability. Yujin listened. Her expression didn't change. When he finished, she asked how much. Daniel replied that, to start with, 5 sacks a week, 10 in a month. In 3 months, 20. Yujin quickly did the math in her head. Then she said that 5 sacks a week would be 10 silver coins. He was willing to pay that much. Daniel replied that he was willing to pay but suggested a different arrangement. A 3-month contract with a fixed price, 1.5 silver coins per sack instead of 2, but with guaranteed sales. She wouldn't have to stand around at the market waiting for random buyers. She knows exactly how much salt is needed each week. She plans her purchases. She manages the flow. Yujin was silent. She was calculating. 1.5 silver coins is a quarter discount, but a stable 3-month contract means 75 sacks. That's 112 silver coins guaranteed. No downtime, no spoilage, no risk. She asked for one condition: the contract in her name, not her father's. Daniel looked at her. Then he said he hadn't offered anything else. It's her salt, her business, her contract. Yujin looked at him for a long time. Then she held out her hand. The handshake was firm, businesslike, without unnecessary emotion. As he was leaving, Yujin called out to him. She asked who he was. Ordinary merchants don't talk like that. Daniel replied that he was no ordinary merchant. Yujin didn't smile, but she nodded. The second objective was more complicated. He needed an apothecary. Not just any apothecary, one who works with alchemical raw materials, glands, livers, bile, blood, everything he intended to extract from the carcasses using the new butchering method. He needed a buyer who knew the value of these things and could turn them into merchandise, potions, ointments, and tinctures. He asked Hannah if she knew any apothecaries in town. Hannah said there was one. On the outskirts of the artisan's quarter, a widow, quiet, keeps to herself. The shop is small, but the merchandise is good. People even come to her from the palace quarter. Name: Minso Park. Daniel went to see her after lunch. The shop stood on a narrow street behind the row of blacksmith shops, a small sign with a leaf drawn on it. Inside, it smelled of herbs, wormwood, mint, something bitter and unfamiliar. Vials and jars lined the shelves, neatly arranged, labeled in fine handwriting. A woman stood behind the counter. Her dark hair was pulled up high. Her face was calm, impassive. Her eyes were attentive and very quiet. She looked at Daniel and said nothing. She waited. Daniel looked over the shelves. He found what he was looking for: a small vial containing a dark liquid. The label stated that it was an extract from the moon gland. He picked up the vial and asked how much it cost. Minso replied, 8 silver coins. Daniel asked how many glands it took to make one vial. Minso replied, 1 whole moon deer gland. Daniel asked how much she paid for the glands. Minso paused. Then she replied, when she can find them. 5 silver coins apiece. But she rarely finds them, maybe once every 2 months. Daniel nodded. So the profit margin is 3 silver pieces per gland. But the bottleneck isn't the profit margin. The bottleneck is that there are almost no glands on the market. Hunters don't remove them. They throw them away with the offal in the forest. He explained to Minso that he could supply her with glands regularly, not once every 2 months, but every 2 weeks. Moon glands, werewolf livers, gallbladders, everything she could process. Minso listened without moving. Only her eyes widened slightly. Daniel proposed the terms. He would supply the raw materials. She would turn them into potions and ointments. Payment would be not in cash, but in a share of the finished products. Half the potions for him, half for her. Minso asked why he needed the potions. Daniel replied that potions were a commodity, expensive, lightweight, and non-perishable. They'd be easy to transport. He would sell them through his network, and Minso would receive a steady supply of raw materials that had previously been unavailable to her. She would be able to work at full capacity, making the potions she knew how to make but couldn't due to a lack of ingredients. Minso was silent for a long time. Daniel waited. He could tell what she was thinking. Not about money, something else. Then she said quietly, she said her husband had died 6 years ago. Lung disease. She needed moon deer gland extract, a full course, 12 doses, 12 glands. She'd gone to every merchant in town, found 3, over the course of a year. It wasn't enough. Daniel was silent. He didn't know what to say. He only knew that there was an item on his to-do list: to set up a supply of moon deer glands through the Wolf Ford cooperatives. The moon deer were moving farther east, but they could still be hunted. He promised Minso that the first shipment of glands would arrive in a month. Minso looked at him. Then she said that if he kept his word, she would work with him. Not for a share, for his word of honor. Because a person who understands the value of moon gland is a rarity greater than the gland itself. Daniel returned home by evening. His legs were buzzing. His back ached. But a plan was taking shape in his mind. Salt. Yujin So, Contract signed. Alchemy. Minso Park. A verbal agreement, but a solid one. Equipment for hunters. Not decided yet. 100 silver. He sat down at the table and began to calculate. Income from the contract with Aldrich. 20 pounds of werewolf meat per week at 4 silver each. 80 silver coins. Expenses for purchasing raw materials. 0 so far. The butchers give it to him for free, but that will end soon. Expenses for salt for preservation. 7.5 silver coins a week. Expenses for vinegar and berries. About 2 silver coins. Expenses for firewood and oil. 1 silver. Net income. Approximately 69 silver per week. Almost 280 per month. But 100 of those are needed for equipment for Wolf Ford right now. So the first month breaks even. However, starting in the second month, supplies will begin arriving from the village. Complete butchering. 17 items. Meat to the capital. Hides to the tanners. Glands to Minso. Tendons to the bowmakers. Bones to the alchemists. Blood powder to the sausage makers. Each item is a separate source of income. 1 werewolf carcass. 15 silver coins from the hunter at his prices. And the final tally after butchering and processing. Daniel counted for a long time. Meat. 12 silver coins. Processed hide. 8. Liver. 3. Tendons. 2. Glands. 4. Hooves. 1. Blood powder. 2. Bile. 1.5. Bones. 3. And another 8 miscellaneous items. Total, about 45 silver pieces from a single carcass. Minus 15 for the hunter. Minus 3 for logistics and storage. Minus 2 for salt and processing. Net profit, 25 silver coins from a single carcass. If the Wolf's Ford Guild delivers 10 carcasses a month, 250 silver coins net. The same from the second village, from the third, from the fifth. In half a year, he could be earning 1,000 silver coins a month. That's more than the annual turnover of the Merryweather shops. From a single butchering method, from a single sound decision. Hannah walked in while he was still doing the math. She looked at the numbers over his shoulder. She was silent for a minute. Then she said it was impossible. Daniel asked why. Hannah replied that it was because no one does it that way. Daniel replied that that was exactly why it would work. Hannah sat down next to him. She picked up a pen. She began checking his calculations. Half an hour later, she looked up and said the numbers added up. If the hunters learn to cut the meat using the new method, if deliveries are regular, if the meat doesn't spoil on the way, if the middlemen don't start throwing a rent in the works, if the guild doesn't catch on too soon. Daniel nodded. A lot of ifs. But each one is surmountable. Butchering. Abby will oversee it. Deliveries. A direct contract. Storage. The ice house. Middlemen. We'll get around them. The guild. That's the trickiest part. But as long as he's a small-time merchant with 3 stalls, the guild isn't paying attention to him. He has a window of opportunity. Maybe 3 months. Maybe half a year. Before someone from the big houses figures out what's going on. During that time, he needs to grow big enough that they can't just crush him. That night he lay awake, thinking about Hawthorne. The clerk acted calmly. Too calmly. He brought the list of butchers as requested. He reported diligently on the stalls. But Hannah found 2 more discrepancies in his records. Minor ones. Almost imperceptible. Someone inexperienced wouldn't have noticed. But Hannah wasn't inexperienced. She was sharp and observant. And that made her the perfect auditor. Daniel decided not to touch Hawthorne just yet. To give him some leeway. To see where he'd take her. To watch. In a week, he'd need to send supplies to Wolf's Ford. 100 silver. He could have earned that much in the first month of selling meat to Aldrich. But a month is a long time. The village would wait 2 weeks. So he needed a loan. Or an advance. Or another move. He thought of Eugene. She has salt in stock. 20 sacks. That's 40 silver at market price. If she agrees to give him the first batch on credit against a future contract, he'll save 7.5 silver in the first week. He thought of Minso. If she starts making potions from the very first ores he brings back, the potions could be sold quickly. 8 silver pieces per vial. That's quick money. He thought about the Merry brothers. Aldrich pays for the meat upon delivery. 80 silver coins a week. If he asked for a month's advance payment, 320 silver coins. That would be enough for supplies for Wolfsford, with some left over for the glacier. But Aldrich wasn't a fool. A month's advance payment, he'd demand a discount, or guarantees, or both. Daniel decided to act in the morning. That morning, he sent a boy to Aldrich with a note. He proposed a meeting. Aldrich arrived after lunch, alone. He sat down at the table. He looked calm. He waited. Daniel proposed the terms. A 2-month contract, £20 a week. The price was 3.5 silver pieces per pound instead of 4, a discount of half a silver piece. But payment in advance for the entire term. Aldrich did the math in his head. 2 months, 8 weeks, £160. At 3.5 each, 560 silver pieces. At the usual price, it would have been 640, a discount of 80 silver pieces. But he was getting a guaranteed supply for 2 months in advance, and he could resell it at a higher price. Aldrich asked why Daniel needed the money up front. Daniel replied that he was expanding his business. Aldrich snorted. He said that expanding the business after only 3 weeks of work was either ambition or foolishness. Daniel replied that he'd show results in 2 months. If Aldrich didn't like it, he could terminate the contract and take back the remainder. Aldrich thought about it for a long time. It took 3 days to purchase the equipment. Daniel personally visited the armorsmiths in the blacksmith's quarter. His legs still ached, but he could already walk for hours without stopping. His body was growing stronger every day without the potion. He bought 6 crossbows. Not the best, but sturdy. Workhorses, 12 silver each. Bolts for them, 5 dozen. 8 pairs of boots made of thick bullhide, 3 silver per pair. 10 snares for large game, 4 silver coins each. Ropes, knives, whetstones. A coil of wire for snares. 2 axes. 3 rolls of heavy cloth for bandages and packing. The total came to 114 silver coins. A little more than he'd expected, but within budget. He hired a wagon and a driver, a sturdy man named Tom, a man of few words, with hands accustomed to handling both reins and an axe at the same time. They loaded the wagon with the supplies. They covered it with a burlap tarp. Mary sat next to the driver. Daniel lay down in the wagon among the sacks and boxes. Hannah stayed in town. She ran the shops and kept an eye on Hawthorne. Before they left, Daniel gave her 3 instructions. First, record everything Hawthorne does, every visit, every letter, every conversation with outsiders. Second, prepare a site for the ice chamber. He explained the plan to her, a pit 2 human heights deep. On the northern slope of the hill behind the Blue Fontanery Street. Line the walls with stone. Fill the bottom with straw. Fill it with river ice. Layer it with straw. Cover it with a lid made of thick planks and an earthen mound. Hannah wrote down every word. Then she asked how he knew how to build ice boxes. Daniel replied that he had read about it. Hannah sighed and said that someday he would tell the truth, or maybe not. The third instruction was simple. If Hawthorne asked for access to the new books Hannah was keeping, refuse. Gently. Say they were personal notes for the mistress. Hannah nodded. The journey to Wolfsford took 2 days. Her body handled the trip better than last time. Daniel even sat up part of the way. He looked around, memorizing the route and estimating distances. From Remhold to the first turn east was 12 miles. The road is smooth. The wagon train can move quickly. From the turn to the fork at Bear Rock, another 8 miles. The road is worse. Ruts. Rocks. The wagon train slows down. From the fork to Wolfsford, 10 miles. The road goes through the forest. Narrow. 1 wagon. An intermediate stop is needed here, a transshipment point. If we set up a warehouse at the fork, a small one, made of stone, with a canopy. Convoys from the capital bring supplies and salt here. People from the village bring their catch here. Exchange. Transshipment. Return trips. No one travels empty. He pulled a sheet of paper from his coat and began to draw. A route map. Transshipment points. Timelines. The caravan from Remhold leaves on Monday morning. By Wednesday evening, it's at the fork. Transshipment on Thursday. Return trip on Friday. By Sunday, the goods are in the capital. 4 days round trip. 2 trips a week if there are 2 convoys. Mary watched him draw. Then she said that her father had never managed to set up even one trip a week in his entire life. Daniel replied that her father didn't know about the intermediate stops. Mary asked how he knew. Daniel remained silent. Mary turned away and looked at the road. She was getting used to his silence in response to certain questions. She was patient for now. But he could see that her patience wasn't endless. They were waiting for them at Wolf Ford. Bran was standing at the edge of town. Abby was standing next to him. And 5 more hunters. They were looking at the wagon. When Tom pulled back the tarp and the hunters saw the crossbows, it went quiet for a moment. Then old Hank walked over. He took the crossbow, examined it, checked the bowstring, swayed it in his hand. He looked at Daniel and asked if it was true that he wasn't paying for it with money. Daniel replied, "It's true. The crossbow costs 12 silver pieces. That's about 1 werewolf carcass at the new prices." The hunter takes the crossbow. The first carcass he hunts counts toward payment. Starting with the second carcass, the hunter receives his full payment. Hank turned to the others. He said something in their village dialect. Daniel didn't understand the words but caught the tone. Approval, cautious but genuine. They handed out the gear. 6 crossbows, 8 pairs of boots, and 10 snares. The rest was divided among the teams. Daniel made sure that everyone who received signed or marked an X on the roster. Hannah would have been proud. Record keeping, documentation, every item, every name. Then the work began. The hunters brought in fresh prey. 2 werewolves killed yesterday. The carcasses lay on wooden racks outside the village. Large, dark fur. Armored plates on the nape of the neck. Muzzles bared. Even dead, they were intimidating. Daniel stepped forward. He looked. In his former life, he'd butchered moose and bears. A werewolf was larger than a bear, and heavier. But the principle was the same. Muscles, tendons, organs, bones. Everything in its place. Only the proportions were different. He nodded to Abby. She approached with a knife. Daniel began to give instructions. The first cut. Along the peritoneum from the sternum to the pelvis. Careful, don't cut the intestines. Abby cut precisely, confidently. She knew the carcass, but she was used to working roughly. Meat on one side, hide on the other, the rest in the pit. Now Daniel was stopping her every 2 movements. Here's the liver. Carefully, don't damage the capsule. Put it here, in a separate container. Cover it with salt right away. Here are the glands. There they are, under the 3rd rib, just as Abby said. 2 cuts. Remove them whole. Wrap them in a damp cloth. Put them in the cold. Here's the gallbladder. Don't puncture it. Cut it off along with the duct. Put it in a jar. Pour vinegar over it. Here are the tendons of the hind legs. Long, elastic. Cut them along the bone. Tie them into a bundle. Dry them in the shade. Here's the blood. It's already started to clot, but some of it is still liquid. Drain it into a bucket. Then spread it in a thin layer on a board. Air dry it. Grind into a powder. Abby worked in silence. Her hands moved faster and faster. She understood the process. She wasn't just memorizing it. She understood it. Why every cut? Why every organ? Where everything goes? 2 hours later, the first carcass was butchered. 17 separate cuts lay on the table in front of them. 4 cuts of meat. The hide, removed cleanly without any cuts. The liver, whole and in salt. 2 glands wrapped in damp cloth. The gallbladder in vinegar. A bundle of tendons. A bundle of nerves. 4 hooves stripped down to the bone. The rib bones for reagents. The limb bones for handles. Wool from the withers, collected separately. Antlers, hooves, blood in a bucket. Fat trimmed from the subcutaneous layer. From a single carcass, 17 items. The hunters stood around watching. Hank walked over. He looked at the table, then at Daniel, then back at the table. He said that in 40 years of hunting, he'd thrown away enough good stuff that he could have bought a village. Daniel replied that he wouldn't throw anything away anymore. Abby butchered the second carcass herself. Daniel just watched and corrected her when necessary. He rarely had to correct her. She was a quick learner. When they were done, Daniel looked at both batches. 34 marketable cuts from 2 carcasses. About 30 silver in net profit after paying the hunters. From 2 carcasses, in a single day. He looked at Mary. She was standing off to the side, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was calm. But her eyes. He saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not admiration, not fear, understanding. She finally saw what he was doing. She hadn't heard it. She'd seen it, and she understood that it worked. That evening at dinner, Bran said that 3 more villages to the east had heard about a merchant from the capital who paid real money. The village elders were asking questions. Daniel replied that it was still too early. First, they needed to test the scheme with Wolf's Ford. 1 month. If everything worked out, he'd go to the rest. Bran nodded. He liked that. A merchant who takes more than he can hold on to. Abby sat in the corner, sharpening a knife. She had been silent all evening, but Daniel noticed that she hadn't taken her eyes off him. He understood why. He had given her village more in a single day than the middlemen had in a year. He had shown that her father's haul was worth 15 times more than what he had been paid. That every werewolf Hank had killed over 40 years was a small fortune, half of which had in a pit in the woods. This wasn't just business. It was the truth that no one had ever spoken before. After dinner, Daniel stepped out onto the porch. The cold autumn air. Stars that weren't in Montana. Or maybe they were different. He didn't know. Mary followed him out. She stood beside him. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she wanted to ask one question and that she needed an honest answer. Daniel waited. Mary asked. She asked if he remembered their wedding. Daniel froze. Someone else's memory stirred. Blurry images. A young man stands before the altar. He doesn't look up. Next to him is a woman in a light-colored dress. She's waiting for him to look at her. He doesn't look. He didn't remember the details. He remembered the fear of the former Daniel, a fear of everything and everyone. Daniel replied that his memory was hazy. The illness had taken many of his memories. Mary was silent. Then she said that at the wedding, he hadn't looked her in the eyes even once. 4 hours. She had been counting, waiting. He never looked at her, and now he looks her in the eyes every time he speaks. And that frightens her more than anything else. Daniel didn't know what to say. He could have told the truth, that he wasn't the man she'd married, that the real Daniel Ashton had died or left or vanished, that a stranger from another world now lived inside his body. But he didn't say it, because the truth would destroy everything right now. Trust, partnership, the business he's building. And because he didn't know how she'd take it, instead of the truth, he said something else. He said that when you've been on the brink of death for a month and don't know if you'll wake up tomorrow, a lot changes. He decided that if he survived, he'd live differently, to look people in the eye, to do what he's good at, not to be afraid. Mary listened. Then she said quietly that that was enough for her, for now. She went inside. Daniel stayed on the porch. He looked up at the stars. He thought about how a lie is also a form of care. Sometimes, when the truth is too big for a single evening. In the morning, they loaded the wagon. The first batch of the haul was headed for the capital. Meat in barrels of salt. Hides rolled up and tied tight. Livers in salt. Glands wrapped in wet cloth and lined with ice from the stream. Tendons in bundles. Hooves in a sack. Bones in a separate box. Dried blood on planks, wrapped in cloth. Tom looked at the cargo and asked what, if anything, of this junk could be sold. Daniel replied that everything could be sold. Tom shook his head and urged the horse on. Abby was standing at the edge of the village. When the wagon pulled up alongside her, she told Daniel that by the next time, she would have 4 more hunters ready. She would teach them how to butcher according to the plan. Daniel thanked her. Abby nodded. Then she added that if anyone in the capital tried to cheat his men, she'd come and explain it personally. Daniel glanced at the knife at her belt and replied that he believed her. On the way back, Mary asked about the glacier. Daniel explained in more detail. A pit, stone, straw, ice. The principle is simple. Cold air is heavier than warm air and sinks. If the pit is deep enough and well insulated, the temperature inside stays low even in summer. Meat keeps for weeks. Hides don't rot. Glands don't spoil. Mary listened. Then she said it was magic. Daniel replied that it was physics. Mary asked what physics was. Daniel paused. Then he said it was a way of understanding how the world works. No spells. No spirits. Just observation and calculation. Mary remained silent for the rest of the journey. They returned to Remhold by evening. Hannah met them at the door. Her expression was serious. She said that while they were away, Hawthorne had gone to the post office twice, and once he'd been seen on Leather Street talking to a man Hannah didn't know. Tall, gray-haired, wearing an expensive coat. Daniel asked for a description. Hannah gave it. Tall, thin, gray hair combed back, a ring on his right hand. He carried himself like a man accustomed to being bowed to. Mary turned pale. She recognized the description. She said it was Garrett Wellcross, the eldest son of Silas Wellcross, the heir to the House of Wellcross, one of the 4 great houses of the Butchers' Guild. Daniel looked at Hannah, then at Mary. Then he sat down at the table, quietly, calmly. He asked Hannah what else she'd noticed. Hannah replied that after the meeting on Tanner Street, Hawthorne had returned to the shop and spent an hour poring over books, his own books, not the ones Hannah keeps track of. Then he put one book in a chest and locked it away. He hadn't done that before. Daniel nodded. Hawthorne was meeting with the Wellcrosses. Hawthorne was hiding something in the books. Hawthorne was sending letters. The picture was becoming clearer. The steward was working for 2 masters. Or he was preparing to switch sides. Or he was reporting on the Ashtons' affairs to someone who paid more. Mary said that Hawthorne had served her father for 30 years, that he couldn't betray him. Daniel looked at her. He said nothing. Mary understood. She lowered her eyes. 30 years of loyal service end when someone pays more, or someone who makes a more terrifying threat. Daniel said he wouldn't do anything for now. Hawthorne doesn't know he's being watched. That's an advantage. Let him think his master is weak and sees nothing. Let him keep meeting with the Wellcrosses. Every meeting is a source of information. It took 5 days to build the ice house. Daniel hired 4 diggers from the lower market. He paid them 1 silver coin a day. He chose the spot himself, behind the warehouse on Leather Street, on the northern slope of the hill. The shadow cast by the warehouse wall kept the area in the shade until noon. The soil was clayey and heavy. They dug slowly. The pit was supposed to be 2 human heights deep and 4 paces wide. Daniel stood over the pit and watched them work. His body could already stand for hours. 3 weeks without the potion. His lungs barely wheezed. His arms had regained their strength. Not superhuman, but enough to hold a quill without trembling and carry a sack of salt. The sides of the pit were lined with stone. Daniel insisted on a double layer. Stone, clay, stone, with straw between the layers for insulation. The thicker the wall, the slower the heat penetrates inside. The diggers looked at him as if he were a city eccentric. They dug cellars for wine and turnips, but they'd never seen a cellar like this. Mary came every day. She watched. She said nothing. On the 3rd day, she brought Aldrich. Aldrich examined the pit. He asked why. Daniel explained. Meat spoils because it's stored in the heat. If you lower the temperature, the meat will stay fresh for weeks. Aldrich asked where to get ice in the summer. Daniel replied that ice is harvested in the winter. River ice. They cut it into blocks. They lower it into the pit. They layer it with straw. The ice melts slowly. With proper insulation, it lasts until midsummer, and by midsummer, ice can be brought in from mountain streams. Aldrich was silent. Then he said that if it worked, he wanted one just like it at his slaughterhouse. Daniel replied that he would build it, for a separate fee. Aldrich chuckled. He said that Daniel knew how to sell even holes in the ground. On the 5th day, the ice house was ready. The bottom was lined with 2 layers of straw. The lid was nailed together from thick oak planks. Soil was piled on top. They left a hatch with a ladder. The ice was to be brought from a mountain stream outside town. Daniel made arrangements with the cart driver, Tom. 2 trips. 6 blocks of ice for each trip. The ice was stacked in layers with straw between them. When Daniel went down into the ice house an hour after it was loaded, it was cold inside. Really cold. He exhaled and saw his breath. It's working. Mary followed him down. She stood there and looked at the frost-covered walls. Then she said quietly that it was impossible. It's fall outside, but here it's winter. Daniel replied that it wasn't winter. It was just a proper pit with proper insulation. Mary shook her head. Then she went back upstairs. Daniel heard her tell Hannah that it was now winter in their storage basement. Hannah went down to take a look. She came back up a minute later and said nothing. She just wrote the date and a note in her notebook. Glacier number 1. Operational. The first batch of harvest from Wolf Ford sold out in 2 days. Meat for Aldrich. He took it all and asked for more. Daniel took the hides to the tanners in the craftsman's quarter. 2 of the 5 master tanners refused. They said a werewolf's hide was too tough. 3 took them on a trial basis. One old master named Barnett looked at the hide and said it was the cleanest he'd seen in 20 years. He asked who had skinned it. Daniel replied that it was a girl from Wolf's Ford. Barnett grunted. He said he'd take whatever they brought. 5 silver pieces apiece. Daniel haggled. 6. Barnett said 5.5. Daniel agreed. 5.5. Better than he'd expected. He took the liver and glands to Minso personally. She unwrapped the bundles on the counter. She examined the liver. She sniffed it. She felt it. Then she examined the glands. 2 of them, intact, wrapped in damp cloth, covered in ice. She looked up at Daniel. She asked how he'd kept them in such good condition. Usually the glands spoil within a day. Daniel replied that it was the cold, the cloth, the ice, and quick removal right after butchering. Minso remained silent. Then she said that from these 2 glands, she would make 4 vials of extract, 8 silver coins each, 32 silver coins, half for him, 16 silver coins from the 2 glands. Daniel nodded. The figures matched his calculations. Minso said she needed 3 days to prepare it. Daniel replied that he would wait. In 3 days, he would collect his share, 2 vials of moon gland extract, which he would sell. To whom? He didn't know yet. But 8 silver coins for a small vial meant the market of the wealthy, the palace district, physicians in noble households. He needed access to that circle. Aldrich. His wife was acquainted with the city judge's wife. The judge was a connection to the palace quarter. The thread was unfolding. He sold the tendons to a bowmaker on Armory Street, an old man named Graham. He looked at the bundle. He pulled on one tendon, bent it, tested it for breakage. Then he said it was the best bowstring material he'd seen in 5 years. He asked how much. Daniel named his price. 2 silver coins for a bundle of 10. Graham didn't haggle. He took both bundles, paid 4 silver coins, and asked if Daniel could supply him regularly. Daniel replied that he could. Another contract. Another thread in the web. He sold the bones to an alchemist at the upper gate. He gave the hooves to the glue makers for 1 silver coin per set. He hasn't sold the blood powder yet. The sausage makers at the market didn't know what to do with it. Daniel explained it to 2 of them. The blood powder is added to the ground meat. It gives the sausage a dark color and a rich flavor. It saves on meat. One sausage maker kicked him out. The second one thought it over. He took a sample to try. He promised to get back to him in a week. He's keeping the fur from the werewolf's neck for now. He needs a fulling miller. Or a felt maker. He'll find one. Later. In total, the first shipment from Wolf's Ford brought in meat, 80 silver from Aldrich, hides, 11 silver from Barnett, potions, 16 silver in the future, tendons, 4, bones and hooves, 5. Total, 116 silver from 2 carcasses, minus 30 to the hunters at the new rates, minus 5 for transportation, minus 3 for salt and supplies. Net profit, 78 silver coins. From 2 carcasses in 1 week. Hannah looked at the final figures and was silent for a long time. Then she said that if they doubled the volume to 4 carcasses a week, the net profit would rise to 150. Because transportation costs wouldn't double. The wagon makes 1 trip. Whether you load a full wagon or half, the difference in transportation cost is 0. Daniel looked at her. He said she had just described the principle of economies of scale. Hannah asked what that was. Daniel explained, the more goods you transport in a single trip, the cheaper each unit of goods costs. Fixed costs are spread over a larger quantity. Hannah took notes. Then she said she wanted to see all the figures for each item in a separate ledger. Revenue from meat separately. Revenue from hides separately. revenue from alchemy separately, so she could tell which item was the most profitable. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Hannah was already thinking like a manager, not as an accountant. He hadn't taught her that. She'd figured it out on her own. A week later, a second shipment arrived from Wolf's Ford. 3 carcasses. Abby sent a note, a short one. She wrote that the hunters had gotten the hang of the process. One had damaged the glands while removing them. She'd shown him how to do it a second time. He wouldn't mess it up again. And one more thing. 2 hunters from the neighboring village of Talsbrook came to Wolf's Ford. They asked about the merchant from the capital. They want the same terms. Daniel read the note and set it on the table. Talsbrook. That's the second village. It's too soon. He'd promised himself a month to get things up and running. But if Talsbrook is coming on its own, that means word has gotten out. The hunters are talking among themselves. News that someone is paying 15 times more for the same game will spread in a matter of weeks. He needs to make a decision. Expanding now is risky. Money is tight. He's short on manpower. Logistics are stretched to the limit. 1 wagon, 1 driver, 1 route. But not expanding is risky too. If he turns Talsbrook down, someone else will snap him up. The middlemen will find out that the hunters want better terms. They'll raise prices to keep suppliers in line. Or conversely, they'll start putting pressure on everyone so that no one dares to work around them. He chose a compromise. He wrote to Abby. Let the hunters from Talsbrook bring their catch to Wolf's Ford. Butchering will follow the same procedure. Payment will be at the same rates. For now, the equipment is only for Wolf Ford's guild. Talsbrook will get its share once Daniel is convinced the system is running smoothly. Abby was meant to be the hub. Not just a butchery supervisor, a liaison between the villages and the capital. The person who receives the game, checks its quality, and dispatches the wagon train. She's 19 years old. She's never managed anything but her own knife. But she's a quick learner, and the hunters trust her, because she's one of them. Daniel dictated a letter to Hannah for Abby with detailed instructions. How to receive the game, how to inspect each item, how to fill out the inventory sheet, how to pack it for transport, and what to do if the goods don't meet standards. Hannah wrote and shook her head. Then she said it sounded more like an army manual than business records. Daniel replied that a good business is just like an army. Only instead of swords, there are shipping documents. Meanwhile, Hawthorne continued to behave as usual. He'd come in the morning. He'd work in the shop. He kept his books. He left in the evening. But Hannah kept track of his every move. Another meeting on Kojavanaya Street. This time, not with Garrett Wellcross, but with a man whom Hannah described as short and stocky with a broken nose. Mary didn't recognize this man. Daniel decided to find out. He sent a boy to follow him. The boy returned 2 hours later and said that the man with the broken nose had entered an office on Melnichnaya Street. The sign read, Grindle Brothers, Appraisal and Transportation. Daniel asked Hannah if she knew the Grindles. Hannah said she did. Small-time haulers. But there were rumors that they took money for special services. Intimidation. Damaging goods. Arson. Daniel nodded. The Wellcrosses are bringing in muscle. For now, they're just keeping an eye on things. But if they decide to act, the Grindles will be their enforcers. He needs to prepare. But first, he needs to do one thing he's been putting off since day one. Deal with the brew. He'd been abstaining for 4 weeks now. His body had grown noticeably stronger. He could climb stairs without getting out of breath. He could walk 3 miles through the city without stopping. His complexion had changed. Mary noticed. She said he looked better than he had in all 4 years of their marriage. Daniel replied that fresh air and work were helping. Mary didn't believe him but kept quiet. He followed the maid Gladys. Quietly. Carefully. Gladys brought the decoction every morning. She prepared it in the kitchen. She took the herbs from a little bag she kept in her storeroom. Daniel waited until Gladys had left for the market. He went into the storeroom. He found the little bag. Inside was a mixture of dried herbs. He sniffed it. That same bitter smell. The herbs looked ordinary. Leaves. Roots. Nothing suspicious to the eye. But he wasn't a herbalist. He couldn't tell what it was just by looking at it. He needed an expert, Minso. He scooped a handful of the herbs into a rag and took it to Minso that same day. He placed it on the counter and asked her to identify the ingredients. Minso unfolded the rag. She sniffed it. She ran her fingers through the herbs. She separated a few leaves. She rubbed them between her fingers. She sniffed again. Then she looked up. Her face was expressionless. Only her eyes had changed. They had grown hard. She said there were 3 medicinal herbs in the mixture. The month passed quickly. 30 days during which Daniel slept 4 hours and worked the rest of the time. His body grew stronger. He could walk from home to the harbor and back without stopping. His lungs no longer wheezed. The cough was completely gone. Mary looked at him every morning as if checking to make sure he was real, that he wouldn't disappear, that yesterday hadn't been a dream. Over the course of the month, 6 wagon loads arrived from Wolf's Ford, 14 werewolf carcasses, 2 bone-eater carcasses, 1 moon deer. The moon deer was the main event. Abby had sent it separately with a note. The antlers were intact. They glowed at night. 6 glands, removed according to the diagram. Everything's in order. And a postscript. Hunters from Tallsbrook brought in 2 more from the village of Hawksmoor. They want to work. Daniel turned the moon deer carcass over in the warehouse. Mary stood nearby. Hannah was behind her. The antlers really did glow, a dim blue light, like phosphorus. In the semi-darkness of the warehouse, it looked otherworldly. Mary said that a pair of those antlers was worth as much as 3 houses in the lower market. Daniel nodded. But he wasn't going to sell the antlers right away. Antlers are capital. You have to hold on to them. Release them onto the market at the right moment when demand is at its peak. Before winter, when the Palace District buys decorations and gifts. As for the moon deer glands, they went to Minso that very same day. 6 of them. Minso accepted them in silence. She turned each one over. She examined them. Then she looked up and said that in 6 years on the job, she had never once held more than 2 glands at a time. And now there were 6 right in front of her. Whole. Fresh. Perfectly preserved. From the 6 glands, she'll make 12 vials of extract. 96 silver pieces. Half for Daniel. 48 silver pieces. From a single deer. Just from the glands. And then there's the meat. And the hide. And the antlers. Daniel began to count. Moon deer meat is more tender than wolf meat. It doesn't need to be soaked. It's enough to cut it up properly and cook it. That's not 4 silver pieces per pound. It's 8. 10. For the tables in the palace quarter. He remembered the judge's wife, who used to order werewolf meat from Aldrich for her dinner parties. What if he offered her moon deer meat? That's a whole different level. He asked Aldrich to arrange a meeting. Aldrich did. 3 days later, Daniel was standing in the city judge's house. The house was large, stone, with stained glass windows. The judge turned out to be a thin man with a long face and watchful eyes. His wife was the complete opposite. Plump, cheerful. She loved to eat and loved to entertain. Daniel brought 3 dishes with him. Moon deer meat sautéed with herbs, that very same venison with rosemary. He served it on a white platter. The judge's wife tasted it. She closed her eyes, opened them, tasted it again. Then she told her husband that they would bring this to the next reception at the palace. The judge looked at Daniel. He asked the price. Daniel quoted 10 silver pieces per pound. The judge didn't bat an eye. For the Palace District, that was a normal price for a delicacy. They didn't sign a contract, but they reached a verbal agreement. 2 pounds a week for the judge's table, and separate orders for receptions. Aldrich stood to one side, doing the math in his head. Daniel could see it on his face. Aldrich realized that his sister's business partner was rising faster than he'd expected, and that both pleased and worried him. On the way back, Aldrich walked alongside Daniel. He remained silent for 2 blocks. Then he said he wanted to propose a deal. He wanted to buy into the business. Not in werewolf meat, in moon deer. He was willing to invest 300 silver pieces in purchasing equipment for the hunters if he were granted the right to resell the moon deer meat through his connections. Daniel thought quickly. 300 silver pieces would cover equipment for Tallsbrook and Hawksmoor, 2 villages. An expansion of the network. But Aldrich has a stake, which means Aldrich is in on it, deeply, not just a buyer, a partner, with his own interests and his own connections, and with his brotherly rights to Mary's property if anything goes wrong. Daniel replied that he'd think about it. Aldrich nodded. He told him not to take too long. Offers have an expiration date. That evening, Daniel told Mary. She listened in silence. Then she said that Aldrich wasn't a fool. He sees the money and wants his share. The question isn't whether to take him on. The question is on what terms. Daniel asked what she suggested. Mary replied, let him invest. But not in a share of the business, in a specific commodity. The right to resell moon deer meat. Only meat. Not hides, not antlers, not glands. Meat. At a fixed price. He buys from the Ashtons at 6 silver pieces per pound and sells for whatever he wants. His risk. His margin. But he doesn't meddle in the rest of the business. And his 300 silver pieces aren't a share. They're an advance payment for the goods. Daniel looked at Mary. Then he said she'd just proposed a dealer model. Mary asked what that was. Daniel replied that it's when a partner buys the right to sell your goods, but doesn't own the business. Mary nodded. She said her father had worked that way with tobacco merchants. He just didn't know that's what it was called. Daniel accepted Mary's terms and presented them to Aldrich. Aldrich thought it over for a day. Then he agreed. 300 silver pieces up front. The right to resell moon deer meat. Meat only. 6 silver pieces per pound from the Ashtons. They signed the contract in Hannah's presence. She kept a record. Every clause. Every figure. 300 silver. Daniel sent Tom to Wolf's Ford with a new shipment. Supplies for Talsbrook and Hawksmoor. Crossbows, boots, traps, and a letter to Abby. In the letter, he appointed her field inspector for 3 villages, Wolf's Ford, Talsbrook, and Hawksmoor. She was responsible for the quality of the butchering in all 3, for inspecting the catch, and for dispatching the wagons. He offered her a salary, 5 silver coins a week. For a country girl, that was a huge amount of money. A week later, Tom returned with an answer. Abby accepted. And there was more. She wrote that her father, Hank, wanted to speak with Daniel in person. Hank knows the roads, all the roads, including those unknown to the middlemen. He's willing to show them one route via Wolf's Trail. It's a day and a half shorter than the main road, but more dangerous. But if you travel in a group with security, it's perfectly passable. Daniel recalled dinner in Wolf's Ford a month ago. Hank had mentioned that trail. A day and a half saved. On regular runs, that's a huge difference. 2 convoys a week instead of 1. Or the same one, but faster. The goods arrive fresher. Less ice melts. The meat is in better condition. He made a mental note. Go to Wolf's Ford again. Travel the Wolf's Trail with Hank. Map it out. Identify the risk points. Decide whether security is needed and how much it will cost. But that's for later. Right now, there's another problem. Hawthorne. Hannah reported that the foreman had started getting nervous. He'd noticed that Daniel was conducting business behind his back. New contracts were being signed without his involvement. New suppliers were coming directly to the boss. Hannah was keeping the new books, not him. Hawthorne had remained silent so far, but his visits to the Co. have become more frequent, twice a week. And he sent yet another letter from the post office. Daniel decided it was time, not to get rid of Hawthorne, but to talk to him. He called him in that morning, sat down at the table across from him, looked him in the eye. Hawthorne looked back steadily. 30 years of training. Daniel said calmly that he knew about the meetings on Kozhavanaya. He knew about the letters. He knew about the chest containing the book that Hawthorne kept locked away. Hawthorne didn't flinch. Only his hands on his knees clenched slightly. He asked how his employer knew. Daniel replied that it didn't matter. Something else is important. He offers Hawthorne a choice. Option 1. Hawthorne tells him what the Wellcrosses want, what he's been passing on to them, and what they're planning, and continues working for the Ashtons, with a raise. Option 2. Hawthorne leaves today, without a reference, and Daniel sends a copy of Hannah's notes about his meetings to every merchant in the lower market. A clerk who spies for competitors will never find work in Remhold. Hawthorne was silent for a long time. Daniel could see his mind working. 30 years of caution. 30 years of survival under various employers. Hawthorne was weighing his options. Then he said that the Wellcrosses wanted to know the Ashtons' shop turnover, volume of goods, suppliers, weak spots. He passed on the figures every 2 weeks. In return, he received 3 silver coins. Daniel asked if there was anything else. Hawthorne paused. Then he said that during their last meeting, Garrett Wellcross had asked about Wolf Ford, about the contract with the village, about the hunters, and about the glacier. Daniel nodded. They already know. That means the window is closing. The Wellcrosses are moving from observation to action. The question is when. Hawthorne said it would be soon. The Wellcrosses' first attempt came 2 weeks later. The wagon train was traveling from the fork in the road toward Remhold. Tom was driving the wagon. Seated next to him was a hunter from Tallsbrook, a young man named Reed. A crossbow rested on his lap. Halfway to town, a wagon blocked the road. Supposedly broken, the axle had cracked. The cargo was scattered across the road. 3 people were bustling about. Tom stopped the horse. Reed grabbed his crossbow and jumped down from the wagon. He walked around the wagon. He looked at the people. Then he looked at the roadside. There in the bushes stood. He saw their tracks before he saw them. A hunter who reads werewolf tracks every day can spot human tracks 100 paces away. Reed returned to Tom and whispered that it was an ambush. 5 of them. Tom didn't wait. He turned the horse around. The wagon headed back toward the fork in the road. The people by the wagon shouted. They ran after them, but the horse was faster. The wagon train returned to Wolf Ford. Daniel found out about it a day later. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting it. That was precisely why the route included an alternate path. The wagon train stayed in the village for 1 day, then it set out again. But not on the main road. It took Wolf's Trail, the very one Hank had mentioned. The old hunter led the caravan himself. The road was narrow, winding through a dense forest. But Hank knew every turn, every rock, every stream. After a day and a half, instead of 3, the caravan reached the northern gates of Remhold. On the other side of the city, where no one was expecting them. Tom delivered the goods to the warehouse. Daniel lowered them into the glacier. The meat was fresh. The glands were intact. The hides were in good condition. The system had worked. The alternate route had proven its worth in the very first week. He sat down and wrote a note to Hawthorne. He asked him to find out the Wellcrosses' reaction to the failed interception. Hawthorne replied the next day. Garrett Wellcross was furious. He yelled at the Grinlows. He demanded his money back. Silas Wellcross Sr. learned of the failure and summoned his son to his office. It's unknown what they discussed, but after the conversation, Garrett became quiet. That was worse than rage. A quiet Garrett meant that his father was now making the decisions. And Silas Wellcross doesn't throw a wrench in the works. Silas operates differently. A week later, Daniel saw it for himself. 3 village elders on the Eastern Road received letters from the guild, official ones, with a seal. The letters stated that trade in game from the wildlands was permitted only through licensed members of the Butchers and Furriers Guild. Any hunter selling game to an unlicensed merchant was in violation of the guild's charter. The penalty? 5 silver coins. Confiscation of the goods. A 1-year ban on selling within the borders of Valamark. Brand sent his letter with the wagon train. Attached to it was a note from Abby, a short one. She wrote that the hunters were frightened. Not all of them, but some. The old ones. Those who remember how the guild ruined the rebellious 20 years ago. Daniel read the guild's letter 3 times. Then he called for Hannah. He asked her to find a copy of the guild's charter. Hannah found it a day later, an old copy in the library at City Hall. Daniel read the charter for 3 hours. Then he found what he was looking for. Article 42. A guild license is required for the retail sale of meat and hides within city limits. No license is required for wholesale purchases from a producer, unless the buyer also engages in retail sales. The Ashtons sold retail through their shops, but purchases in the villages were made in the name of Meriwether Ashton as a wholesale supplier, and the shops operated under old licenses issued back when Mary's father was still alive. Formally, everything was in order. Daniel wrote a reply to the village elders. He attached an excerpt from the charter. He explained that the guild was trying to intimidate them, but had no legal grounds for fines. Purchasing from hunters is not retail trade. It is the wholesale purchase of raw materials, which is not regulated by the charter. And he asked Abby to read this letter to the hunters in person, to every hunting party, to every foreman. Abby read it aloud. Bran calmed down. But two hunters from Hawksmoor still refused to work. They were scared. They went back to the middlemen. Daniel didn't try to stop them. You can't hold people by force. Only through profit and trust. The rest stayed. Because the price difference was too great. Half a silver coin from the middleman or 15 from Ashton. The choice is obvious to anyone who can count. 2 days after the incident with the guild's letters, something else happened. Daniel finally went down to the basement. The Ashton house stood on old foundations. The basement was large and dark. Stone walls, a low ceiling. Mary kept barrels of salted meat and sacks of grain here. In the far corner, the wall looked different from the rest. The stones were laid more evenly. The mortar between them was fresher. Daniel tapped on the wall. A hollow sound. There was nothing behind it. He found a tool, a chisel and a hammer. He worked quietly, alone, at night. Mary was asleep upstairs. So was Hannah. He removed 4 stones. Behind them, a niche opened up. A small one, about the size of a chest. Inside stood a box, wooden, with a brass lock. The lock was simple. Daniel pried it open with a knife. Inside were papers, 12 sheets, covered in fine handwriting. The same handwriting he'd seen on his first day in Hawthorne's ledgers. No, not Hawthorne's. The handwriting was similar but different, finer, neater. It was the handwriting of the former Daniel Ashton. Daniel brought the candle closer and began to read. The text was encrypted. Not complicated, a simple letter substitution. But reading it took time. It took him an hour to decipher the first sheet. It was a letter addressed to someone unnamed. The former Daniel wrote that he had discovered discrepancies in the Butchers Guild's tax records. The guild reported its collections from the trade and game to the crown, but the amounts in the reports didn't match the actual turnover. The third month, 5 villages, 8 cooperatives. The wagon trains ran twice a week. One along the main road, the second via Wolf's Trail. Tom hired a second wagon driver, a quiet guy named Craig, broad-shouldered, a former soldier. Daniel paid him 4 silver coins a week and didn't ask where the scars on his hands came from. The ice house worked flawlessly. The meat kept for weeks. Daniel was building a second ice house, not next to the warehouse, but at the fork in the road by Bear Rock, a way station. Hunters brought their catch here. The meat was chilled here. From here, it went to the capital already cold. Transportation losses dropped by 2/3. Hannah kept the books with a precision that made Hawthorne's eyes pop out of his head. Every item, every carcass, every silver coin. She kept a separate notebook for each sales channel: meat, hides, alchemy, tendons, bones, and blood powder. The sausage maker from the lower market finally got a taste of the powder. He ordered 5 pounds to try. A week later, he ordered 20 more. His sausages became darker and richer. Customers noticed. Demand rose. Now he needs the powder every week. Another thread. Another person who depends on the Ashtons. Merryweather had changed. Not all at once. Gradually. She stopped counting her debts before bed. Because there were no more debts. She stopped going to the market at 6 in the morning to beat the middlemen to it. Because the goods now arrived at the warehouse on their own. She stopped fearing the knock at the door. Because it wasn't creditors standing at the door, but customers. One evening, Daniel came home late. He'd been at Minso's, picking up a shipment of potions. 12 vials of moon gland extract. 6 were his. Minso had left 1 extra, beyond what was in the contract. She said it was a gift. Daniel didn't argue. He carried the vials to my place. When he walked in, Mary was sitting in the kitchen. There was a cup of tea in front of her. She wasn't drinking it. She was just sitting there, staring at the wall. Daniel set the box of vials on the shelf. He sat down across from her. He asked what had happened. Mary was silent for a minute. Then she said that a neighbor had come to see her today, the weaver's wife from Mill Street. She asked if it was true that Ashton's was now the richest trading house in the lower market. Mary replied that no, it wasn't the richest, but business was going well. The neighbor said the whole market was talking about it. That Mary's husband had gotten out of bed and turned everything around in 3 months. That he had ice houses where it was winter in the middle of summer. That hunters in the East worked exclusively for him. That his meat was served at the judge's table. Mary said she'd heard all this and didn't recognize her own life. 3 months ago, she was about to lose her warehouse. Now her courtyard was full of goods, and she had customers from the Palace District. She said she didn't know how to feel about it. Daniel asked how she felt. Mary replied that she was afraid. Daniel waited. Mary said she was afraid because everything was going too well. She grew up in a merchant's family. She knew that when things are going well, trouble is never far away. Daniel remained silent. Because she was right. Trouble was never far away. He just didn't want to tell her that right now. Instead, he stood up. He went to the kitchen. He put the kettle on. He made tea. Not herbal. Regular. Black. With mint. The kind Mary loved. He brought 2 cups. Set one in front of her. Sat down beside her. Without saying a word. Mary took the cup. She drank in silence. Then she said quietly that her mother used to make her this mint tea a long time ago. Back when Mary was little and afraid of thunderstorms. Daniel didn't reply. He didn't know that the Daniel she'd known before had never once made her tea. In 4 years. Not even once. They sat in silence and drank their tea. And that was the moment when Meriwether Ashton began to do more than just accept her new husband. She began to love him. All over again. For the first time. Truly. Not the timid boy she'd been married off to, but this quiet, calm man who brings her tea when she's afraid. In the morning, Daniel sat down to decipher the letters from the basement. He worked at night, slowly, letter by letter. In a month, he had deciphered 4 of the 12 letters. The picture was coming together. The old Daniel had discovered that the Butchers' Guild was collecting a tax from merchants for the crown, 2% of every transaction. But only half of it reached the treasury. The other half ended up in the hands of the guild's elders. 4 houses, the Wellcrosses, the Garners, the Tresks, and the Ports. 4 families who had been dividing the stolen taxes among themselves for 30 years. 2,000 gold pieces a year, 60,000 over 30 years. The former Daniel discovered this stream of money by accident. While helping Mary with the ledgers, which he did, after all, occasionally open, despite what Mary thought, he noticed that the tax amounts Hawthorne paid on behalf of the Ashthones didn't match what was listed on the guild's receipts. He began to dig. Quietly. At night. The 6th month. The first wagon bearing the Ashton mark arrived in the capital. Not at a shop in the lower market. To the main trading square. A wagon with a stretched awning bearing a mark. A shield with a crossed knife and scales. The Ashton mark. Daniel had drawn it himself. Hannah ordered an iron seal from the blacksmith. Every sack, every barrel, every bundle was branded with this seal. Standard. Grade A meat. Grade B meat. First cut hide. Second cut hide. Fresh liver. Salted liver. Every item is labeled. Every customer knows what they're getting. Not by eye. Not on trust. By the brand. Before the Ashtons, the entire hunting market in Remhold operated on trust and by feel. The merchant would feel the meat, sniff it, tasted it, haggled. Every transaction was its own little show. After the Ashtons, a price list appeared. Meat A, 6 silver coins per pound. Meat B, 4. First cut hide, 8 per piece. And so on. The buyer doesn't haggle. The buyer chooses from a catalog. It seemed like a small thing, but it changed everything. Because standardization means predictability. All predictability means trust. And trust means money. A week after the brand appeared, a man from the Army Quartermaster's office came to see Daniel. A young officer. Polite. With a piece of paper. The Army needs boots. 3,000 pairs by winter. Werewolf leather is best suited. Durable. Water-resistant, flexible. But the Army can't find enough leather of consistent quality. With the middlemen, every hide is different. Different sizes, different thicknesses, different tanning methods. It's impossible to make standard boots from non-standard leather. And that's where a trading house with a hallmark and categories comes in. First cut hides. Uniform thickness. Uniform tanning method. Uniform quality of the split. The officer asked if Daniel could supply 500 first-cut hides in 3 months. Daniel asked for a day to run the numbers. The officer agreed. Daniel sat down at the table with Hannah. They calculated for 3 hours. 500 hides. That's about 250 werewolves. In 3 months. 83 carcasses a month. 20 a week. Currently, about 15 carcasses a week were coming in through the network from 5 villages. We need 5 more. We need to increase the harvest by 1/3. This is possible if we bring in 3 more villages and expand the cooperatives in the existing ones. But that means more equipment, more supply trains, more ice ships, more people. He sent Abby a letter. He asked how many more villages along the Eastern Road were ready to work. Abby replied 4 days later. 3 villages, Talwood, Stonehaven, and Craiglock. All 3 have been asking to join since spring. The hunters are waiting. Daniel did the math. Supplies for 3 villages, 300 silver, 3 intermediate glaciers, 90. Hiring 2 more carters, 30 for the first month. Total, 420 silver. He had 300 in reserve. He needed another 120. He went to see Aldrich. He explained the situation. An army contract, 500 hides, big money. But he needed an investment to expand. Aldrich listened. Then he asked how much the army contract was worth. Daniel answered, 500 hides at 8 silver each, 4,000 silver. Aldrich was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said he'd give 200, not 120, 200. Let the extra 80 go toward the 4th glacier. Because Aldrich calculates and sees that the glaciers are the key. Meat that doesn't spoil can be sold whenever you want, not just when you have to. Daniel accepted. 200 silver pieces. Aldrich signed the paper. Hannah certified it. His relationship with Aldrich was changing. From the brazen brother-in-law who'd come to seize the warehouse, he was turning into a business partner. Not a friend. A partner. A man who sees a profit and goes after it. That suited Daniel just fine. A partner with his own interests is more predictable than a friend. He returned to the quartermaster's officer. He signed the contract. 500 first-cut hides over 3 months. Delivered in batches of 50 every 2 weeks. Payment upon delivery. The price was 8 silver pieces per hide. 4,000 silver pieces. This was the Ashtons' first contract with the crown. Not through the guild, but directly. When Daniel placed the signed contract on the table in front of Mary, she read it twice. Then she looked up. Her eyes were wet. She said that her father had dreamed his whole life of a royal contract. He died before it came to pass. Daniel replied that this was only the beginning. News of the contract spread quickly. Within 3 days, the entire lower market knew. The Ashtons were supplying leather for army boots. For the army. For the crown. It was a blow to the guild. Not a legal one, a reputational one. For 30 years, the 4 major trading houses had supplied the army through their own channels. Now a small trading house, not even a year old, had snatched the contract. Not because it was cheaper, because it was better. Standard hides of uniform quality, stamped and graded. Exactly what the army had wanted for years, but couldn't get from the guild. Silas Wellcross found out that very same day. Hawthorne reported that the old man took the news in silence. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just sat at the table and stared out the window for a long time. Then he summoned his sons, both of them, Garrett and the younger Thomas. What they talked about is unknown. But after the conversation, Garrett left town. He headed east toward the villages. Hawthorne suspected that Garrett had gone to poach hunters to offer them more than Daniel was paying. Daniel smiled when he heard this. Let him try. The Wellcrosses can offer more money. But they can't offer equipment in exchange for a share. They can't offer a full split. They can't offer glaciers along the route. They can't offer a brand and a standard. They can't offer respect. A poacher comes along and says, "Sell it to me cheaper." Daniel comes along and says, "Let's work together." The difference isn't in the money. The difference is in the attitude. The hunters can sense that. A week later, Garrett returned. Hawthorne said he was angry. Not a single village agreed. Bran of Wolf's Ford listened to his proposal and replied briefly. He said that Ashton had given them crossbows when the Wellcrosses were slapping them around. Garrett left empty-handed. Daniel took it in stride, but he knew Silas wouldn't give up. Money and persuasion hadn't worked. Bandits on the road hadn't worked. Letters from the guild hadn't worked. Bribing the hunters hadn't worked. What next? Silas is smart, patient. He'll find a weak spot and strike there. Daniel's weak spot is his body, his health. A single rumor that the Ashton's husband is on the verge of death again, and the partners will start to get nervous. Contracts will falter. Trust will crumble. And there's one more weak spot. Mary, her brothers. Aldrich has invested money, but his loyalty is based on profit. If profits are called into question, Aldrich will switch sides. Hart hasn't said a word for 3 months. What he's thinking is unknown. Daniel decided to shore up his weak spots. First, his health. He started going for a walk every morning. 3 miles through the city, then 4, then 5. His body adjusted. His muscles grew stronger. His face took on a healthy glow. He ate more. He slept more whenever he could. He asked Min So to prepare a restorative concoction. A real one. No gray heather. Min So prepared it. Bitter but beneficial. He drank it every evening. Second, Aldrich. Daniel offered him a seat on the trading house's board. Not formally, in practice. Twice a month, the 3 of them would meet. Daniel, Mary, Aldrich. They discussed business. Aldrich saw the numbers. He saw growth. He saw the potential. That tied him down more firmly than any contract. A man who sees a growing business from the inside won't run off to the competition. He'll run after a new stake. Third, Hart. Daniel invited him to dinner. Hart came. Quiet, wary. Daniel offered him a contract. Hart's slaughterhouse on the southern outskirts stood half empty. If Hart took on the butchering of werewolf meat according to the Ashton standards, Daniel would supply him with raw materials. Full capacity. The 9th month. The Ashton business no longer fit into 3 shops and 1 warehouse. Daniel rented a 2-story building on Market Street, a former inn, stone walls, a spacious courtyard for wagons, a cellar for the ice house. The 2nd floor served as an office. Hannah was the first to move in. She brought all the books with her. She arranged them on the shelves. She hung a map of the eastern route on the wall, with the villages and wagon routes marked. The map grew more crowded with markings every week. 8 villages, 12 cooperatives, 4 intermediate ice houses, 2 main routes and 3 alternate ones, 9 carters, 11 regular customers in the capital, an army contract for hides, a contract with the magistrate's kitchen for moon deer meat, a contract with the tanner Barnett, a contract with bowmaker Graham, a contract with the sausage maker, a contract with Min So's apothecary shop, a contract with 3 alchemists for bones and reagents, and 4 more minor contracts that Hannah had secured herself while Daniel was traveling east. She had learned, not just how to keep the books, but how to negotiate. Numbers were her weapon. She would approach a buyer with a notebook detailing quantities, deadlines, prices, and terms. The buyer didn't see a girl from a poor family, but a business person with documentation. And they agreed. Because dealing with Hannah was convenient, predictable, reliable. Yujin So expanded her salt shipments to 30 sacks a week. Her market stall had grown into a full-fledged office with 2 assistants. The contract was still in her name, not her father's. Her father had arrived in Remhold a month ago. He saw the office. He saw the turnover. He tried to interfere. Yujin shut the door in his face. Literally. She told him it was her business, and that he'd lost the right to have an opinion when he sold her caravan to pay off a gambling debt. Her father left. Yujin didn't cry. She just went back behind the counter and kept working. But that evening, she went to see Daniel. They sat in the office on the 2nd floor. Yujin silently sipped her tea. Then she said one sentence. She said she was grateful for the contract. Daniel replied that the contract wasn't a favor but business. Yujin smiled wryly. She said she knew that. But she was grateful all the same, because he was the first person who signed a contract in her name without asking where her father or husband was. Min So was working at full capacity. 12 types of potions, extracts, ointments, tinctures. Her shop on the outskirts of the artisan quarter had become too cramped. Daniel suggested she move closer to Market Street. He found a space. He paid the rent for the first quarter. Min So refused to let him pay. She said she would pay for it herself, from her share of the potions. Daniel didn't insist. She's proud. So be it. Minso moved. The new shop was bright and spacious. On the shelves stood vials bearing a new hallmark, a shield with a crossed knife and scales, the Ashton mark, on the potions. Minso had asked for it herself. She said the mark was a sign of quality. When a customer sees it, they know there's genuine merchandise inside, not just tinted water. Abby came to the capital once every 2 weeks. She brought reports, verbal ones. She didn't like to write, but she learned to count. Daniel gave her a simple system: sticks and notches on wooden tags. Each tag represented one carcass. Notches on the tag marked the quantities: how much meat, how many hides, how many glands. Abby collected the tags from all 8 villages and brought them to Hannah. Hannah converted the notches into numbers. The numbers went into the ledgers. The ledgers painted a picture. Abby had changed over the past 6 months, not on the outside, on the inside. She still wore leather pants with a knife on her belt, but she spoke differently, more confidently, more quietly, without unnecessary boldness. She knew her worth, not because anyone had told her, because she saw the numbers. 12 cooperatives were operating according to her standards. Not a single piece of metal had been lost in 3 months. Not a single convoy had returned with damaged goods. That was her work, her system. Hank had come by too, once. Daniel sat with him in the office for 2 hours. The old hunter was drawing a map of the wildlands from memory. Roads, trails, animal paths, watering holes, places where the beasts gathered before migrating. Daniel listened and took notes. That map was worth more than the entire warehouse on Leather Street. Because it was knowledge. Knowledge that no one in the capital possessed. Not the guild, not the crown, not the army. Hank knew the wildlands like the back of his hand. And now that knowledge lay on Daniel's desk. When Hank left, Daniel gave him a bundle. Inside were oats, made of bone-breaker hide, soft soles, specially made for people with sore. Daniel had ordered them from the leatherworker Barnett, based on the measurements Abby had secretly taken from her father. Hank unwrapped the bundle. He looked at the boots, then at Daniel. He said nothing, but his hands trembled as he put them on. Daniel Ashton's former physician, the very one who prescribed the morning decoction with gray heather. Daniel found him, a doctor named Grauer. He had a practice on Pharmacy Street. Daniel didn't go to see him himself. He sent Minso. She went as a colleague, one pharmacist to another. She asked about a recipe for a decoction to treat the lungs. She mentioned the ingredients: mint, chamomile, and dandelion root. Grauer confirmed it was his recipe, Stan Dart. Minso asked if gray heather was included in the ingredients. Grauer was surprised. He said no. He never uses gray heather. It's a dangerous plant. Minso thanked him and left. So gray heather wasn't added according to the recipe. Someone else had added it, Gladys, or whoever had given her the herbs. Daniel decided to take action, quietly. He asked Hannah to follow Gladys on her day off. Hannah did. A year, 12 months since that morning when Daniel Crow opened his eyes in a stranger's body. He stood by the office window and looked out at the courtyard. 3 carts were being loaded simultaneously. The carters worked in perfect unison. Barrels bearing the company's stamp were lined up in rows. Grade A meat on the first cart, hides on the second, alchemical raw materials on the third. Hannah stood in the courtyard with a notebook, checking off each item. Her voice was steady and commanding. Over the course of a year, she had grown from a quiet freeloader into the operations manager. Daniel trusted her completely. Her books were impeccable. Every silver coin was accounted for. Every barrel was recorded. Every route was scheduled by the day. Mary stood next to him by the window. She rarely came to the office. She had her own stalls, 3 in the lower market, plus a new 4th one in the crafts district. She managed them herself, calmly, without fuss, without fear. Over the past year, she had gained weight, just a little but noticeably. Her face had softened, and the dark circles under her eyes had faded. Her hands were no longer dry from constant work. Because now she had assistants, people she'd hired herself, whom she paid well, who worked not out of fear but out of respect. She'd learned this from Daniel, not with words, by example. Today was a special day. The royal quartermaster had sent a letter. He'd requested a meeting, in person, at the Ashton's office. Not at the palace. At the office. That meant he was coming as a supplicant, not as an official. The quartermaster arrived in the afternoon. A tall, thin man in a plain military uniform. No entourage. Just one aide at the door. He sat down at the table, accepted a cup of tea, looked at the map on the wall, for a long time. Then he spoke. The army is stationed on the eastern border. 3 garrisons, 2,000 men. Supplies come through the guild. More precisely through the House of Wellcross, which has held the contract for 30 consecutive years to supply food and equipment to the eastern garrisons. The problem is that the deliveries are falling through. The meat arrives rotten. The leather arrives damp. The boots fall apart after 2 months. The soldiers are starving. The officers are complaining. Winter is approaching. One more winter like this, and the Eastern Army will start to fall apart. The quartermaster said that the crown needs a new supplier, one that's reliable, stable, and guarantees quality. He looked at the brand on the barrels in the courtyard and said he'd heard about the Ashton standards, and about the glaciers, and about how not a single Ashton supply train had arrived with spoiled goods in the past 6 months. Not a single one. Daniel listened in silence. Then he asked what volume was being discussed. The quartermaster replied, meat, 200 pounds a week. Leather for boots and belts, 50 hides a month. Lard for candles and lubrication, tendons for bowstrings, blood powder for soldiers' rations, and more. Potions, medicinal ones. For the garrison doctors, extract from the moon gland, ointments for frostbite, tinctures for wounds, a full supply, all from a single source. Daniel looked at Mary. She was standing by the wall listening. Her face was calm, but her hands were trembling slightly. She understood the scale of it. This wasn't a contract for 500 hides. This was a full supply for the Eastern Army. That meant thousands of silver coins a month. It meant reaching a level from which there was no going back to the 3 stalls in the lower market. Daniel asked for 3 days to work out the figures. The quartermaster nodded. He stood up. At the door, he turned around and said one thing. He said that the House of Wellcross would not be pleased, and that the crown could not guarantee protection from the guild. But it could guarantee that the contract would be fulfilled and paid for. Daniel replied that he would provide protection from the guild himself. They counted down the 3 days. Daniel, Hannah, Cassandra, and Mary. The 4 of them sat at a table piled high with books and maps. Cassandra proved to be indispensable. She knew the Wellcross system inside and out. She knew where their weak spots were. She knew why their shipments were falling through. Too many middlemen. No standards. No cold storage. The same problems Daniel had seen on his first day when he opened the Ashton ledgers. Only on the scale of the entire guild. The calculations showed that the Ashtons could fulfill the contract, but only just. They needed 5 more villages, 3 more glaciers, 4 more carters, and they needed someone in the east to coordinate everything on the ground. Not from the capital, from the field headquarters. Abby, Daniel wrote to her. A long letter, his first long one. He explained the situation, the army contract, its scale, and what was required of her. Not just an inspector, the manager of the eastern operation, her own ice mine at Wolf's Ford, her own staff, 2 assistants, the authority to make decisions on the spot without consulting Remhold, a salary of 20 silver coins a week. Abby replied 3 days later, in one word, agreed, and a P.S. She asked him to send more paper for tags. The old ones were all used up. Daniel signed a contract with the quartermaster, 4,000 silver coins a month. Full supplies for the 3 eastern garrisons, deliveries to begin in 6 weeks. When the news reached Silas Wellcross, what Daniel had expected happened. Silence. For a week. Then Hawthorne reported. Silas summoned the heads of all 4 houses of the guild. The Wellcrosses, the Garners, the Tresks, the Ports. A closed-door meeting. 4 hours. What they discussed is unknown. But after the meeting, a messenger arrived at the Ashtons' home with an official invitation. The Butchers and Tanners Guild invites Daniel Ashton to a meeting of the Grand Council to discuss the terms of the Ashton House's admission to the guild. Hannah read the invitation aloud. Then she looked at Daniel. He was silent. He was thinking. Joining the guild. Is this a trap or an acknowledgement? Or both? If he joins the guild, he'll have to submit to its rules, its charter, its quotas, the council's decisions. The 4 old houses will vote against him, 4-1. He'll lose every vote. But if he refused, the guild would unite against him. All 4 houses. Not each one separately, as was the case now. All together. That was a different level of pressure. Legal, political, economic, and perhaps even physical. He chose a third path. He accepted the invitation. But he didn't come alone. He brought documents. Winter came early. Snow fell in early November. By the end of the month, the roads were buried. The caravans slowed down, but they didn't stop. Because Daniel had been preparing for winter since summer. The ice reserves in the glaciers had been replenished. The straw had been replaced. The lids were insulated with a double layer. Rest stops for the drivers' overnight stays had been cleared along the routes. Firewood had been stockpiled in every village to heat the staging areas. The caravans moved on. More slowly, but they moved on. The first crisis struck in December, a blizzard. 3 days. The roads were blocked. The Ashton convoy got stuck at the pass between Talsbrook and the fork in the road. 4 wagons, 12 barrels of meat, 6 bundles of hides for the army. The driver Craig and 2 hunters. That same night, a royal caravan carrying provisions for the eastern garrison got stuck. Not an Ashton caravan, an old one. One that still traveled through the guild's canals. 30 wagons, no guards, no supplies, no plan. A messenger arrived at Daniel's that night, frozen to the bone, waist deep in snow. He said the garrison in the east was starving. 3 villages were cut off. The quartermaster is in a panic. He's asking for help, any kind. Daniel didn't make a fuss. He sat down at the map. Mary brought candles. Hannah fetched the books. Cassandra unfolded the supply list. Daniel was silent for 10 minutes. He stared at the map. Then he began giving orders. Hannah, find the contracts with the villages Talsbrook. Their ice house is full. Winter meat supplies, enough to feed the garrison for a week. Contact their village head, immediately. Eugene, salt, 20 sacks. Load them onto the reserve wagon at the north gate. Abby, pass the order on through Tom. Find old Hank. He knows the wolf trail in winter. He's the only one who can guide a wagon train through the forest in a blizzard. Mary. A letter to the quartermaster. The convoy will depart in 6 hours. Delivery in 4 days. Payment after delivery at the usual price. No rush surcharge. Cassandra looked up. She asked why there was no surcharge. Any merchant in this situation would double the price. They'd ask for triple. The garrison is starving. The crown will pay whatever they're told. Daniel replied briefly. Because a rush fee is a one-time payment. But the reputation of a man who saved the garrison at the standard rate lasts forever. Cassandra fell silent. Then she nodded. The convoy set out in 6 hours, as promised. Hank led it through Wolf Trail. The old man knew every tree, every rock, every turn, even under 2 feet of snow. 3 hunters from Wolf Ford led the way, breaking trail. Behind them, the wagons moved slowly, laboriously, but they were moving. 4 days later, the convoy reached the garrison. Meat from the Talsbrook Glacier, salted fish, blood powder for porridge, lard, a sack of salt, and 12 vials of medicinal extract from Minso for the garrison doctors. The garrison commander came out to meet the convoy in person. He stood in the cold with his head uncovered. He watched as the barrels were unloaded. Then he approached Craig and asked who had sent them. Craig replied, Ashton Trading House, Remhold. The commander took note. A week later, a letter from the commander was on the quartermaster's desk. 2 weeks later, the king knew about it. The quartermaster came to see Daniel a second time, not with a contract, with a question from the king. The king asked who had arranged it. The quartermaster replied, a merchant, Ashton. He didn't even demand a rush fee. The king was silent for a long time. Then he said, invite him to the palace. Daniel received the invitation the next day, thick paper, the royal seal, an audience in a week. Mary held the letter with both hands. She looked at the seal, then at Daniel, then back at the seal. She said quietly that her family had been in the trade for 3 generations. No Ashton had ever set foot in the palace. Daniel replied that it was time. Mary smiled, for the first time in a long while. Then she said she had nothing to wear. It was the first time she'd joked in front of him. Daniel laughed. Quietly, briefly, but he laughed. And Mary looked at him as if that laugh was worth more than a royal invitation. Daniel spent a week preparing. Not for the ceremony, for the conversation. He knew the king hadn't summoned him to express gratitude. Kings don't express gratitude. They use people. The question was exactly how. Daniel went to the palace alone, in simple, dark clothes. No brocade, no furs, no rings. He walked down a long corridor past portraits and tapestries, thinking about how, in his former life, he'd had to attend meetings with corporate executives. The palace wasn't much different. The same long corridors, the same portraits of founders, the same scent of power and old money. The king turned out to be a short man in his 50s, a graying beard, tired eyes, hands accustomed to a quill rather than a sword. He sat at a desk piled high with papers, not on a throne, at a desk. 1 year and 3 months. The war with House Wellcross had entered an open phase, though not the one Silas had expected. Daniel didn't attack. He didn't bribe. He didn't scheme. He simply stopped selling raw materials to the Wellcrosses. Quietly, without fanfare. No ultimatums. The Wellcrosses were buying meat and hides from middlemen in the lower market. But the middlemen were buying from hunters. And the hunters were now working for the Ashtons, all of them. 15 villages, 20 cooperatives. The entire eastern supply chain. The middlemen had nothing to sell. The shelves were emptying. The Wellcrosses didn't notice it the first week. By the second week, they grew concerned. By the third, they began looking for alternative suppliers. They found 2 small independent hunters who didn't work with the Ashtons. It was enough for 3 days of trade. By the 4th week, the Wellcrosses' warehouses were empty. The meat was gone. The hides were gone. The alchemical raw materials were gone. Their contracts were in jeopardy. Their customers were leaving. Their reputation was crumbling. The 5th week, the Garners and the Tresks from the guild came to the Ashtons for goods, separately from the Wellcrosses, quietly, through the back door. Daniel sold to them, at the usual price. No strings attached, no schadenfreude, just business. The Garners and Tresks got the message. Ashton isn't the guild's enemy. Ashton is the enemy of those who stand in Ashton's way. Those who don't get in the way buy at the usual price and sleep soundly. Week 6. The Ports had joined forces with the Garners and the Tresks. 3 out of the guild's 4 houses were now buying raw materials through the Ashtons. The Wellcrosses were left on their own. Week 7. Silas Wellcross sent a messenger. He requested a meeting. In person. Daniel agreed. The meeting took place at the Ashtons' office, at the same table where the quartermaster had sat a month earlier. Silas came alone. No sons. No bodyguards. An old man in an expensive coat. Back straight. A heavy gaze. But without fire. The fire had gone out sometime around the 4th week, when his main client had gone over to the Garners. He sat down, accepted a cup of tea, looked at the map on the wall, at the bookshelves, at the crest on the door. Then he said he hadn't come to give in, he'd come to talk. Daniel replied that he was listening. Silas spoke for an hour, without a break. He recounted how, 30 years ago, he had created his system, how he had elevated the Wellcrosses from small traders to the guild's leading house, how he controlled the market, how he fed the army, how he fought off competitors. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining why he did what he did, why he believed it was right. Order, control, predictability. He believed the market needed to be kept in check, that without a firm hand, there would be chaos, that hunters couldn't decide for themselves who to sell to because they didn't understand the market. Daniel listened in silence. When Silas finished, he asked one question. He asked if Silas knew how much the guild was stealing from the crown through inflated tax reports. Silas froze. Then he slowly placed his hands on the table. He looked at Daniel. Daniel took out an envelope. He set it down beside him. He didn't open it. He just set it down. He said that inside the envelope were copies of decrypted letters from the former Daniel Ashton, correspondence with the Treasury, evidence of the embezzlement of 2,000 gold pieces a year, 30 years, 60,000 gold pieces, 4 houses, split evenly. Silas looked at the envelope, then at Daniel, then back at the envelope. Daniel said he wasn't going to use this. Not yet. If the guild accepts the partnership terms he proposed at the Grand Council, the envelope will remain unopened. Forever. The past will remain in the past. But if any of the 4 houses tried once more to interfere with the Ashtons' work, the envelope would land on the king's desk. Personally, at the monthly briefing. Silas was silent for a long time. Then he said the phrase that Daniel would remember forever. He said he didn't approve of Daniel's methods, but he acknowledged that Daniel had built what Silas himself had been unable to build. And he asked that it be protected, because empires made of paper burn the fastest. Daniel replied that his empire wasn't made of paper. It was made of ice, of salt, of flesh, of people who get up every morning and do their jobs. And that doesn't burn. It can only be melted. And that takes time. Augusta's Ashton's enemies no longer have. Silas stood up. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. The handshake was brief and firm, not friendly but businesslike. The peace treaty was signed 3 days later at a meeting of the Grand Council. All 4 houses. The Ashtons joined the guild as the 5th house, with the right to veto decisions on Eastern shipments, with a monopoly on logistics, with a fixed share of 5% of turnover. Hannah personally certified every page of the treaty, 26 pages, 214 clauses. She spent 3 nights writing them. Daniel edited. Cassandra proofread. Mary affixed the seal. After the signing, Silas approached Daniel. Quietly, off the record. He said one thing. He said that his daughter Cassandra had gone missing 4 months ago and that he knew where she was. Daniel replied that Cassandra worked for the Ashtons. 2 years later, a winter evening. It's been snowing since morning. Quiet. Heavy. It settles on the roofs of Remhold in an even white layer. The courtyard of the Ashton trading house is lit by lanterns. Large iron lanterns on poles. Candles inside. The light is warm and even. Today is the grand opening. Not of the shops, not of the warehouse, but of the trading courtyard. The 2-story stone building on Trade Street has been completely renovated. First floor, a sales hall with counters. Each counter is for a separate category of goods. Meat, hides, alchemical raw materials, potions, blood powder, tendons, bones, wolf werewolf wool felt, hoof glue. Everything is stamped. Everything is priced according to the menu. Everything is standardized. Second floor, a large hall, a long table, set for 40 people. White tablecloths, clay jugs of wine, plates, cutlery. On the table, meat from the Ashtons glaciers, venison with rosemary, seared werewolf meat with juniper, sausages with blood powder, bread from the southern fields, salt from Eugene So, wine, a gift from the House of Wellcross. In the basement, the glacier hums, the largest in the city. 3 chambers, constant temperature. Meat can be stored there for months. People have been arriving since noon. Merchants from all over the kingdom. Artisans from the crafts district. Carters, tanners, alchemists, sausage makers. Barnett arrives, an old tanner. He sits down in a corner. He picks up a mug of beer. He looks around the room and shakes his head. A year ago, he bought his first hide from Daniel. Today, his workshop is running at full capacity, making boots for the royal army. Graham arrives, a master bowmaker, a quiet old man with sinewy hands. He sits down next to Barnett. They've known each other for 40 years, but they've never sat at the same table with the quartermaster. Today they do. The quartermaster arrives, in full dress uniform, with his aide. He sits in the seat Hannah indicates. She commands like a general at a roll call. A seat for every guest, a place for every jug, a serving time for every dish. Hannah is wearing a new dress, dark blue, austere. Her hair is pulled back. In her hands, not a notebook but a wine glass. But the notebook lies under the table. She checked. The guild arrives, all 4 families, the Garners with their wives, the Treskys with their sons, the Ports with their daughters, and the Wellcrosses. Silas Wellcross enters last, alone, without his sons. In a simple, expensive doublet, gray-haired, upright. He looks around the room, at the emblem on the wall, at the people at the table. He sits down at the far end, silently. Yujin arrives early. She sits down next to Min So. They've known each other for half a year. They've become friends. A strange friendship. A salt merchant and a pharmacist. But both know what it means to build a business on their own, without a man's signature on the documents. That bond is stronger than any friendship. Min So is wearing a light-colored dress today. For the first time in 6 years, she's wearing something other than her work apron. Yujin noticed. She didn't say anything, she just smiled slightly. Min So gave a slight smile in return. Abby arrived yesterday, for the first time in 2 months, from Wolf's Ford. She's standing by the window, grumbling. She's wearing a dress, for the first time in her life. Hannah made her. Abby tugs at the hem and frowns. The dress is too long, too tight, too uncomfortable. Tied to her hip under the dress is a butcher's knife. Hannah knows. She pretended she hadn't noticed. Hank is sitting in the corner in his new boots made from a bone-breaker's hide. He hasn't taken them off since the day he got them. He says his feet don't hurt for the first time in 20 years. He's drinking beer and staying silent. He doesn't like big city gatherings. But he came. Because he was invited. And because the person who invited him remembers his aching joints. Tom is sitting by the door. Craig is next to him. Both are wearing clean shirts. Both are awkwardly holding their mugs. The wagon drivers aren't used to fancy dinners, but they're here. Because without them, not a single wagon train would have made it to the capital. Cassandra stands by the window next to Abby. They aren't friends. They respect each other, which for both of them is more complicated than friendship. Cassandra looks at the snow. She knows her father is sitting at the far end of the table. Tomorrow he'll find out that she's staying with the Ashtons. Forever. She's already written him a letter. She hasn't sent it yet. She'll send it in the morning. Aldrich and Hart are sitting next to Mary. Both are dressed nicely. Both are calm. Satisfied. In 2 years, they've earned more with the Ashtons than in the previous 10 years. Aldrich is no longer the brother-in-law who came to take things away. He's become a partner. Not a friend. But a partner who can be trusted. Because his interests align with those of the family. And the family's interests now lie with the House of Ashton. Mary is standing by the staircase waiting, in a new dress, dark green, with a high collar. Her hair is styled, earrings that belonged to her mother. She is beautiful, truly beautiful, not tired, not worn out. A beautiful 31-year-old woman who, for the first time in a long time, isn't afraid of tomorrow. Daniel stands beside her, in simple, plain, dark clothes, not in brocade, not in furs. He's holding her arm. She's grown accustomed to his touch, to his calmness, to the way he looks at a room full of people and sees not guests but a system. Every person at this table is a node in the network he's been building for 2 years. Everyone is needed. Each is in their place. Each does what they do best. And each knows that their work is important. Not because Daniel said so, because he showed them. Every day, with every action. With every waybill signed on time. With every wagon arriving on schedule. With every cup of tea served when needed. Daniel raises his glass. The room falls silent. He speaks briefly. He says he never wanted to be the kingdom's leading merchant. He wanted his wife to stop fearing tomorrow. It turned out that to do so, he had to rebuild the entire market. He thanks everyone who helped. He asks them to eat and drink. Meat from their glaciers. Salt from Yujin So. Bread from the southern fields. Wine. A gift from the House of Wellcross, for which he is especially grateful. Silas, at the far end of the table, smiles for the first time this evening. Just the corner of his mouth. But he's smiling. Hannah discreetly wipes her eyes. She thinks no one is watching. Cassandra sees her. She says nothing. Abby runs her fingers through her hair and grumbles that the speech is too long. Next to her, Hank nods. He agrees. Min So exchanges a glance with Yujin. They both understand something, without words. Aldrich raises his mug and takes a drink. Hart does the same. Tom and Craig clink glasses by the door, quietly. Arnett and Graham nod to each other. The quartermaster stands drinking a toast to Dom Ashton. Mary stands next to Daniel. She isn't crying. She isn't smiling. She's just standing there. She's holding his arm. She looks out at the room full of people who came because they believe. Not in goods. Not in money. In a person. In a quiet, calm person who came out of nowhere and gave each of them what they wanted most of all. Not wealth. Not fame. A place. Their own place in a cause that makes sense. She's thinking one thing. Simple. Quiet. Whoever he really is. Thank you for coming. Daniel looks out at the room and thinks of something else. That in a month, the first school for hunters will open. At Wolfford. Where they'll teach not only how to shoot, but also how to butcher. How to preserve game. How to keep records. Abby will be teaching. Hannah will write the course materials. About how, in the basement behind a false wall, there are letters explaining who was hounding the former Daniel and why it's connected to the crown itself. He deciphered all 12 of them. The last letter from the former Daniel was written a week before his death. In a delirium. In shaky handwriting. One sentence. If whoever hears this sends someone in my place, let them forgive me and finish what I didn't have time to complete. Daniel read that sentence for the first time 3 months ago. He reread it many times. And every time he thought of one thing. The former Daniel knew. Not how, not where, but he knew he was dying. And he knew someone would come. He believed it, and he asked for one thing, to finish it. Daniel stands in the hall he built, next to the woman who trusts him, surrounded by the people he gathered. And he knows he's fulfilled the request. He finished it. Not everything, but the most important part. A home where there's nothing to fear. Mary is by his side. Hannah is at the table, counting how much wine is left. Abby is arguing with Craig about which root is best in winter. Eugene is telling Minso about a new variety of salt from the southern reefs. Cassandra is standing by the window, watching the snow. Hank finishes his beer and asks for another. Silas Wellcross silently eats venison and loses himself in his old thoughts. Outside the window, the first real snow of this winter is falling. The Ashton caravans are traveling along the kingdom's 17 roads tonight. Not a single one will be late. Mary takes his hand. Gently. Tightly. He squeezes her hand in response. And that gesture says it all. The whole story. The entire journey. From the sick man's bed to the king's table. From a werewolf's single leg to the 17 roads. From the man who couldn't make it to the kitchen, to the man who keeps a roof over the heads of everyone living in this house. Quietly, without fanfare, simply because that's the right thing to do. Snow is falling, candles are burning, people are eating, caravans are passing by, and that's all you need to know.